I think we're live.
We're live.
Okay. Well, good morning.
Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. So this week's free school, we're gonna start with a debrief of last week's event at Mosque number 12 of the Nation of Islam. And so I'll let Samir and Eddie begin that. But then after the debrief, we'll have a discussion of the Black social system and the realization of world-colored modernity. And I think Herbo will discuss some of Nandita's avant-garde article, which is specifically about the realization of the world's colored modernity and the role of the African American people as a world historic force. And so Herbo will talk about Nandita's article and also build on it, and then that'll begin a discussion. So without further ado, I'll first pass it to Eddie and Samir to assess last week's event.
Yeah, coming into the event, man, ooh, I was nervous. I wanted, not only did I want to do a good job, of course, I wanted to be able to have a deep relationship with mosque. I wanted to be able to connect with the people of Germantown. And of course, we wanted to be able to have a dialogue. And so let's say, just being at the mosque, I think was very special for us. One, that the Nation of Islam doesn't really let people into their space like that. It's their fortress for them to do politics and put forward their ideas. So just them having us there was strengthening in that relationship. And the connection that we were able to have with the audience, for example, I think it was quite substantial that people like Jasmine or that Italian brother of the Nation of Islam felt so compelled to share their advice with us, and I think they're warm, kind-hearted people, but I think it was the quality of the event that made them feel that they could connect with us on that basis. Just even before the event started, the quality of the space. I remember Jasmine came up to me and she was like, "Oh, no, I don't know you, but or you don't know me, but I know you, and I just want to say I really love you." Which really caught me off guard. It opened me up. It really caught me off guard. And she's like, "Yeah, I'm listening to what y'all saying, and you don't know it, but the work that you're doing has an impact and reach that you might not be aware. So I just have to let you know." So, I mean, that was just before we even started, and then of course her comments in the question answering was a signifier to me that we're able to reach the heart. More on being in that space. It felt very different from being anywhere else. It felt very freeing for us to say and talk about whatever we wanted in the way that we wanted. And I think it's because we were in a black space. And so you didn't have to qualify yourself. You didn't have to explain yourself. You could just talk about, for example, Zionism, and you didn't have to be defensive. You didn't have to be careful in someone else misinterpreting you. You could just say what you thought. So just being in that space, I think, was substantial. And in facilitating, you have a certain plan in your mind of how you want the conversation to go, and then it never actually turns out that way. But I think it was quite successful in that we were able to talk about war and peace. We're able to talk about love. We're able to talk about the youth. We're able to assert the revolutionary James Baldwin, and we're able to put forward that chronology. And the impact it has on people, I think it's always hard to measure. I think this is something that we can get a sense of in practice. But honestly and humbly speaking, I think that we had something to offer the people of North Philadelphia and even the Nation of Islam in terms of ideas. that can make sense this moment and chart a path for the future. I think Minister Rodney recognizes that, and Samir will be able to talk more about his conversation with Rodney also next week. I think we were able to offer something well received and appreciated. Hopefully, the start of continued and fulfilling relationship starting with clause number 12.
Yeah, I think the Nation of Islam is such an interesting organization. Unlike other religions, if you know me, I'm interested in religion and what it means. Unlike other religions, the Nation of Islam is, what I would call materialist religion, where they're not concerned, well, I mean, they are concerned with the hereafter, but their primary concern is the here and now, and the current conditions. The current conditions have a big impact on the Nation of Islam, and when they're talking, during their services or their Juma, their concern, unlike other Islamic sects, is freedom, but today. And I think that's something that traditional Sunni Islam is a weak point of it because Sunni Islam is primary trend in politics is political quietism, meaning if you go to Saudi Arabia, the home of Islam, and you go to a mosque, they won't talk about politics. Or if you go to Egypt, the home of the oldest Islamic university in the world, they won't talk about politics. Part of that is uh, the governments. Part of that is the history of Sunni Islam, but also part of that is cowardice, and that has to be noted. So the Nation of Islam, they're no cowards, and during one of the Sunday services, Minister Rodney said, we can't always be preaching to people; we have to listen to them. And the Nation of Islam is unique in terms of Islam, but not unique in the Black community, in that they're interested in forming coalitions to advance the cause of freedom. And Germantown has a lot of, it's not just the Nation of Islam, there's all kinds of Islamic and other, Black Israelite and Moorish Temple of Science. And, Doc introduced us to Prophet Cherry and, Father Divine's Divine Hotel is up in, on Fairmount. So, okay, the list goes on and on. You get the point. Those they don't all get along. They have different views. And that's just Germantown. We didn't even talk about the rest of Philly. So in this one neighborhood, you have a lot of a spectrum of Islamic thought. And so, yeah, I mean, it's a heavy task to unite all these people. But we took a step toward it by uniting with the Nation of Islam. And how many other organizations can you say, can say that they, work closely with the Nation of Islam? I know Kwame Ture, he was giving a lecture that I watched, and he said, I think it was Elijah Muhammad, it could have been Farrakhan. I think it was Farrakhan actually offered Kwame Ture security protection, and he said, "Oh no, thank you." And Farrakhan said, "Oh, you think I'm offering it to you? No, I'm demanding that the FOI protect you. You have no choice in the matter." Something like that. I'm paraphrasing. Um, but yeah, the next day I talked to Minister Rodney. Well, first he had his service. He quoted James Baldwin at the beginning, talking about a man who chooses to be ignorant is complicit in his own assassination. And then he quoted Baldwin at the end again. And I really think that the importance of Baldwin is really on Minister Rodney's mind. And the Nation of Islam is a real top-down organization. And Minister Rodney is a regional student minister. So his thoughts, his words are important for the rest of the Nation of Islam and their members. And so it's just, I think we did have an impact, I think, and then, at the end of service, I thanked him. I gave him some Baldwin t-shirts. And, I asked him if he'd like to do it again in January. And he said they'd be busy with the Savior's Day. I think they're incredibly busy. The whole month of October and then November, then holidays are in December, and January they'll be getting ready for Savior's Day. February will be Savior's Day, and then Ramadan. So, if you're a Nation of Islam member, you're a member, committed to this organization. You have to show up to all these things, and yeah, but I mean that just makes me think about the preschool and how we're all committed. I want to thank all of you, for doing preschool that day and then coming up to Germantown and basically the whole day. I think that you're all militants. And it demands that this idea of a militant be redefined in the modern world. Um, you know, um, Yeah, and then also like the impact of the event. Like I think we all, if you have an event, you want lots of people to come and hear your ideas. And Eddie and I were a little disappointed that not a lot of the Nation of Islam brothers came out. But that's not our metric of success. And our metric of success is the ideological impact that we have. And thankfully, because we recorded it and live streamed um, that Sunday, the day after, I got a bunch of brothers there, their numbers, and I texted them the link to the event. And a lot of them actually told me, "Oh, I'm so sorry I missed the event. I had this or that, or this was going on in my life." One man told me he thought he was supposed to be there to stand close at the door, but he fell asleep, and they called him and he didn't pick up. I understand you're a lot older than me too, but I fall asleep for things too. And and so, I mean, basically, the struggle continues. The struggle for ideas continues. You don't just evaluate an event on that one night and the metrics of that one night. You evaluate it on the metrics of the lasting impact over time that it has. And I think it did affect Minister Rodney, and the conversation elevated his thinking as well as all ours. But also, I think that the nation probably sees us differently because they know that we are want to work with them, and not just the Nation Mosque 12, but other mosques we see, through the live stream that we're interested in working with. So I think Rodney being from Chicago, and especially the older generation, they consider themselves community organizers, and I think that that's good and all, but in a time like this, from what we learn about Doc, we want to be ideological soldiers. We want to be in the ideological struggle. We're not here to mobilize people, and so in evaluating the event in that way, and then evaluating the event, from what I've learned from the preschool about the Year of Two Boys, where it's an ongoing struggle for ideas. I think the event was pretty successful.
Well, I said this last week at dinner afterwards, but I think it was Brandon and Chanda when they were walking in. They were the ones that pointed it out to me that they were like, we don't remember an event not organized by the Nation of Islam happening inside the mosque before. And that was very significant that we were having this event at the mosque itself, because the Nation of Islam has had to defend itself from all of the different ways that the ruling elite has tried to destroy the Black community, culturally and politically. And the Nation of Islam is very much like you guys were saying, highly disciplined in order to preserve, stand up to the ruling elite and also preserve what it can of what I guess we would call the Black social system in some ways. And I thought it was really moving to be in this space. And in particular, I was watching because I was sitting in the back in order to run the live streams documentary, as Jeremiah was running it with Brother Jabril in the front. And I was watching people's heads from the back and their reactions to the documentary. And it's always really moving to watch the documentary with new people, new spaces. And first of all, it says a lot that people can recognize the selection of music, because music is not just about how it sounds. Music is ideological. And for us making the documentary, it was a big deal to choose the music and discover things about what music fits with like certain ideas and what music does not fit and does not have a place. And Brother Calvin, who helped us set up the actual like all the different tech, the camera and the sound, and he was sweating because he was working so hard. I don't think he was actually meant, he wasn't going to stay, he said. But then he stayed because of the documentary. And he came up to me, he said, he was kind of incredulous. He was like, "You made that?" I was like, "Yeah, I was part of making that documentary." He was like, "That was fantastic." And he kept confirming with me, he's like, "This is on the internet, right? This is gonna be on the internet?" And I was like, "Yeah, it's on the internet." And I sent him the link. And it shows how powerful, like Samir was saying, it shows the power of ideas. That truly it is the power of ideas and the ideological struggle that can help the people, like the whole American people, but especially Black people. It helps increase that capacity to decide the future, to see your role in deciding the future, and then also decide the future. And I also was watching Minister Rodney because he was sitting in the way back too. And I saw his like emotional reactions to certain ideas and certain music. And yeah, it's just really fulfilling because to me it was the greatest evidence of the heart and soul of free school. That we're an organization that believes that ideas change the future. Like it's great ideas, the right ideas that determine the future, like King would say, chaos or community. And like Minister Rodney, like I think everyone is impacted by Emmett Till's mother. Like that is a very core experience that I think I never realized for Black people in America. And it says something about the people's chronology of America.
Right.
And I also think another thing that's interesting is that people understand the first half, which is basically our clarification of chronology, that we're in an unfinished struggle for freedom, and even though we've had emancipation, there's that, and then the second half is where do we go from here, and what is our greatest weapon to decide the future, which is love. Like that is everything that our struggle has taught, like our struggle in America has taught us. And it's funny because Brother Calvin gave the feedback. He was like, "You guys should have ended with Aretha Franklin." I was very disappointed, like that you didn't end with Aretha Franklin but it's because like I noticed it pretty heavily. That first verse in Holy Holy is about like, come on, we got to come together, and we can shake this earth's foundation.
Right.
Yeah, it was that the lyrics this time hit me pretty hard. Where I was like, "Oh, you're so stupid, Emily." Like, that's literally that's everything you need to talk about the political future of this country. And I think that documentary also, first of all, I think that whole event showed the power of ideas. And I also think that's why Minister Rodney was very impacted, because Minister Rodney and the Brothers of the Nation of Islam is an organization that is founded upon great ideas. The way that Du Bois talks about what's the most significant thing about the African American people is the spiritual world, which is that ideological, philosophical, like imaginary that like has kept the people going. And I thought the conversation was also really beautiful. Like Eddie mentioned, the participation of Jasmine and Sean, that man who Alice recruited from the park, like a few minutes before the event, that this is something that ordinary people are exactly hungry for. Ideological conversations about the future, about the children. And I think that kind of conversation we should continue, especially at the end about the children. I just also wanted to highlight the brother Taurus. 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 I thought his name was Taurus. Brother Taurus. Yeah, the brother who talked about his like heritage, being Black and Italian, and how vulnerable he was. But the way he said, the way we're talking about the crisis of youth, it didn't start. It didn't start now. It started, I know it because I was one of those youth when I was in the 80s. Like this started in the 80s. To me, it showed that, like, I really think along with the tours that we've been doing with Doc of deindustrialized North Philly, I really think that where the year of Baldwin is heading and where I think it should head is like what this exact counter revolution against the civil rights movement that happened in the 80s, or where did it come from and how did it deliberately destroy the Black community so that there will be no more kings, there will be no more civil rights movement, there will be, and you had to go deep and in all directions: culture, economy, jobs, like community, religion. Like it's deep, and that's what hearing Brother Torres talk about. No, the crisis of the youth. It happened. It happened. It has been happening since the 80s. So what happens when you have not just one youth, but generation after generation after generation of attack on the youth? And I think that's also that's why you also highlight Brother Gregory's story. I mean, that's the story of his life, is also that of both resilience, but also is a reflection of an attack on Black children and Black young people, in particular, like young men in a specific case, like through incarceration. And yeah, so I thought it was a very successful event. And like Samir said, I don't think it's the quantity of people that makes a difference. It's the quality of both what happens in that space in terms of ideas, like, changing the ideological landscape, which I feel confident in saying we are, but also to me, it clarified, I think, the imperative. To me, I think that the event at the mosque clarified a certain imperative ideologically to me. That was like, oh, there has been a great counter-revolution of the civil rights movement. And I think and when we say James Baldwin's a theorist of crisis, of this crisis, we're talking about a theorist who was experiencing who experienced the Great Revolution and saw the Great Counter-Revolution. And I think that's, in some ways, Baldwin's role that we should talk more about. So, yeah, and I really commend, I was telling Samir this too, but I really commend Eddie and Samir for having faith in the Nation of Islam, because I think every event in the ideological struggle requires us as individuals and human beings to have such faith in the ideological struggle that we're ready to pursue it to its end. And yeah, I think it's a great achievement to have done that event at the Nation of Islam. And I think we've learned a lot about what we need to dedicate ourselves to ideologically.
Yeah, this event and conversation is making me think back to something King had said. I don't have the direct quote, but essentially how he said that we must work as hard as the war makers. And I think in the way that we've talked about in preschool, where the culture, the values, the ideology, like ideological bombardment of the people. We talked about the impact of hip hop and rap and the Blackness leadership class, so forth. So they're working very hard. And I think because of it, it's also taken me some time to understand what we mean when we say the ideological struggle or the education of the people. Because I think when I first came to preschool, or when we started the year of Baldwin, it wasn't as concrete or clear to me of like what preschool is in the business of, or what preschool is doing. And it's only through the year in which we have worked with, developing, consolidating why we see Baldwin as instrumental, why we see it as a revolutionary, and through building relationships with different institutions and meeting different people, that it's become clear, which is that, yeah, our society and people aren't on the same page about the importance of someone like King, Baldwin, Du Bois, aren't on the same page of where we are and what the revolutionary task is, or the unfulfilled task is. And Um, I say that because, yeah, it's been through the year and been through the event that it's something sort of clicked for me, which is that it doesn't come easy, where, you know, there are all these headwinds from the ruling elite. And essentially our fight is to engage with people and to fight that battle, where whether it's with institutions, I mean, I think that NOI is a unique case where they've had to defend themselves for so long. And with that, there's not an immediate trust to take us in good faith. You don't know where you're coming from, or if they're actually committed for the same struggle that they are, which is the oppression of Black folk in this country. And so, like, building on what Emily was saying, which is like Samir and Eddie, like, what does it mean to have built that relationship with the Nation of Islam, and also like the other institutions that the free school is involved with, because it's not always smooth sailing. Where, you know, we come in and we're like, Baldwin's important. We should talk about Baldwin for these reasons. It doesn't just happen in a day. It happens over, you know, I mean, we've been doing this since February, and still, I think many of us feel like it's an ongoing struggle. But it's not an easy feat, like Emily had said, which is, or Brandon and John had said, which is for them to have allowed the free school to have this event there, to have an engagement conversation. And I think definitely like with the people that, because I was also sitting in the back as well, where it was resonating. It was resonating with people from a deep place, not just from like both from like like intellectual perspective, but also deep within their hearts, where people are moved by the music, moved by the struggle of Black folk in this country. And I think I'm still making sense of the event too, but this is also in the context of the year, all of the work that the rest of free school has been doing as well. Oh, one last, actually, a point that I wanted to make earlier, which is that in these relationships, like I think how it isn't transactional too, which is oftentimes it's figuring out like actually why is it that the nation has welcomed us into their space, which is that they both see that like the principle of our ideas and also the individuals that we are, and like as equal partners figuring out how to go about the event, but also how to go about the struggle as well. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think leading up to the event, because we were trying to do like promo for it on social media, and I've been rereading James Baldwin's like his account of his encounter and meeting with the most honorable Elijah Muhammad in the Zionist time, and I had never remembered this particular quote, which he uses to kind of lead up to describing the meeting with Elijah Muhammad. But I thought it was really appropriate for even like why we're working with the nation, what does it mean, what does the nation represent, where Baldwin says, it is a threat of universal extinction hanging over all the world today that changes totally and forever the nature of reality and brings into devastating question the true meaning of man's history. We human beings now have the power to exterminate ourselves. This seems to be the entire sum of our achievement. We have taken this journey and arrived at this place in God's name. This, then, is the best that God, the white God, can do. If that is so, then it is time to replace him. Replace him with what? And this void, this despair, this torment is felt everywhere in the West, from the streets of Stockholm to the churches of New Orleans and the sidewalks of Harlem. And I think, because, you know, we've been talking about Black Social System, this book, Black Gods of the Metropolis, and, you know, kind of discussing the Nation of Islam and the Hebrew Israelites, I guess. And yeah, it's like part of this question of like, yeah, like, why do you need a quote unquote black God? And it's like, oh, shouldn't God be raceless? Shouldn't God be like, why should we try to kind of project like this question of race onto God and onto questions of
I'm sorry.
no, and onto questions of the divine, of the sacred and theology and all that. And I think I don't have all the answers for it. I think this is one of the larger questions which we've been working out over a long period of time. But I think part of it is like how we understand what we call like Western civilization or white civilization, in which so central to even, and we've talked about this before, but so central to the kind of constitution of what makes up the civilization in which we find ourselves is this idea of God, or this even Christianity itself, in which kind of like Christianity is kind of necessary for the construal of like what you could call even an American nation or the American civilization. And I think part of what Baldwin points out is that, yeah, the emergence of the Nation of Islam in like the midst of the 20th century is in many ways a response to what Du Bois sees, to what Baldwin sees, which is the failure of white civilization, and essentially a civilization that will drag the world to the brink of destruction and to annihilation. And it's like, okay, well, if that's what civilization means, if that's what God means, then we need a new God. Like we need a new concept of God. And Baldwin, I think, as someone who's like a son of the church, I think he talks about like how his concept of God is basically like as a liberating concept, as not and not as one to control people. And I think I also bring that up because, you know, we published a few presentations recently from the science conference, and Shambarta wrote a report about the science conference, which we did in June. And one of them, Raju's presentation on the state, Raju makes the argument that today the American state exists and functions not even primarily to protect property relations or to, it's not even primarily based on how Lenin would say the control over the means of production. But today, the American state, its kind of primary function and its drive, and I think you can also see this in the way that they talk about themselves, the ruling elite talks about themselves, is the defense of Western civilization and the defense of the supremacy of Western civilization. And it struck me as we were talking that in some ways, part of how you can explain the Nation of Islam is they almost function like a state. They almost function like they do function. There's a reason why they're called the nation. And in many ways, they operate in defense of a nascent black civilization. And this helps to explain why they operate the way that they do. And but it's difficult because it's not a civilization which has been recognized by the world. It's a civilization which is basically having to be born out of the destruction and battles of like what we call the West or what we call white civilization. And it's one that is constantly under attack, as well, like you guys are saying. And I don't know, I was just thinking about that as part of even like how we understand like what we call the black social system and what groups like the Nation of Islam or what movements like the Nation of Islam represent in that sense. And a few other things that stood out to me were, in a way, it's like Baldwin prepared me to, because I was doing like some tech stuff with Brother Jabril, who is like, he's kind of really into like camera work. So if you watch the live stream of the event, he was the one who was like switching between all these different camera angles, and we were really impressed because we have this owl that we use, but we're nothing close to their setup for when they do live streams because they have like 4 different cameras, which is really nice. Like we were like, whoa, this is a crazy setup. We've never had this before. But yeah, I don't know. There's just something about people in the nation that's very beautiful, and I don't know if I've ever really met. Like it's like you don't like you don't really meet those kinds of people. I think, especially if you're kind of socialized into essentially the white world in a way that many of us have been. And I think one thing I forgot to say about the civilization thing is there's nowhere else that I've really found a discourse on civilization itself other than the free school and the Nation of Islam. There, I think Minister Rodney in particular, he talks about civilization. It's kind of almost one of their operative categories in the kind of body of thought that the Nation of Islam represents. And I always like how Minister Rodney, I think he says this many times, but he's like, you have to go, our kind of drive is like, you have to go deep into the earth and mine the gold out of, and he's basically saying it's like, yeah, like the true gold and like the truest representatives of like a new civilization are found not in high places or not amongst elite circles, but it is found amongst the people. And it is found amongst, like the wretched of the earth. And it is found amongst, the prisoners, people who have been cast aside by society, people who have been punished by society. And I always appreciate that because I feel like he says that a lot, and I always appreciate that framing. And I think the other thing is like related to that. It's like, it's like the irony is they're both a very disciplined organization, but also it's like when you sit through, I guess what they call meetings, like their Sunday meetings or Sunday service, because I always equate it to a service because I grew up in the church. But it's like interesting because like I've never, like you sit through like an hour and a half of like Mr. Rodney talking, but it's like having grown up in essentially like both white immigrant churches, I've never had to think so much sitting through a meeting in the Nation of Islam. And they're really challenging you to think, and they're really challenging you to question things. And I think that's something I really appreciate about them, which also makes it very conducive to a discourse and dialogue with them. That the last thing I'll say is, I was talking to another younger brother Dante, afterwards, and he was saying that because I was like, oh, what did you think about the conversation of Black youth and where are Black youth? And he was like, yeah, Black youth are in the streets, and I think this is also partially what, in some ways, a distinct task that a group like the Nation of Islam is able to do, which in some ways actually I don't know we're fully able to do, which is like we're like, he's like, we in the nation are going out into the streets and we're actually like talking to people. We're like knocking on people's doors. And like, he was equating himself. So that's how, I think it was like Master Fard Muhammad, like how he had started was like knocking on people's doors, going around. And he was like, like we call it going in the trenches. And I think just the way that they describe it, it's like we have our own way of kind of bringing the ideological struggle to people. But I think in a lot of ways, like in a way that we're not even organizationally capable of as free school, like they're able to actually go out and try to find, especially young people. And I think that the event itself raised that question of, in particular, as kind of one of the central questions that we have to deal with. And I think, as you guys were saying, I think part of what I've been realizing over the past couple of weeks when we talk about this counter-revolution against the civil rights movement, and also how, in some ways, how do you make sense of the genocide in Gaza? In part, I think it's hugely people will kind of draw these kind of superficial comparisons and say, oh, the IDF trains with like police departments in the US, which is true. And I think that's kind of the sum of how people talk about the similarities between racism in the US and then what has happened in Israel with the Palestinians. But I think in more significant and deeper ways, I think what essentially, like whether you call it the Jewish community or the Zionist community, however they call themselves, what has been done to Black people basically since the 70s and with the counter-revolution against Black people, it doesn't take exactly the same form, but there, in some ways, how you can explain the brutality and the depravity of the total Israeli society posture towards the Palestinians is in some ways explained by, these were people who actually brought over a certain ideology from the United States, in which so many of the so-called leaders in Israel like literally like either are from America or trained in America, like educated in America, like Netanyahu's literally like went to high school or whatever in Philly, and yeah, I think that it's been dawning on me that in some ways part of how you can explain even the current genocide by Israel is because they drew certain things from the American system and from particularly that period of the onslaught against the Black community. And yeah, I don't know. It's the funny thing is that there's a way to there's a name for the relationship between Israel and the Palestinians or Israel and the Arab world, which is Zionism. But there's not really a name for the relationship between the Jewish community and the Black community, which Baldwin talks about a lot. And the only real name we have for it is whiteness. But it's not something which is recognized also as like kind of on the same scale as like a world problem in the way that Zionism is, which I think is part of our task to make that realized as like an actual world problem.
Yeah, well, I wanted to add, like, what Jeremiah was saying about the nation as a defense of Black civilization. I think that really clarifies, um, like, like I know how I and many of us were feeling afterwards the event, because I think in some ways it was a very advanced, and it was a very moving and advanced event. And I think, yeah, watching the documentary, every time we watch it, there's something more that clicks for me, but also how people respond. I know how, like, Reverend Ike, for instance, how, like, he was responding to the documentary and the music. I mean, it speaks to people in a certain way. But I wanted to say that, even the discussion after the documentary was very advanced, because I think we felt more free in having this conversation. And I think the nation has a lot to do with it. The nation being, this place where it's almost like you have this, almost this guarantee that, okay, like, we don't need to prove why we are talking about Baldwin, or why Baldwin is a revolutionary, or, yeah, we don't need to prove any of that. And I mean, this is similar to what we had been talking about last week, what you mentioned about Zion, uh, and it shows the consciousness of the Black poor. And I think, the conversation after the documentary was, um, I think it felt very free, because what we were talking about, really, the only challenge that can be mounted against the formulations that speakers had and so on, it really can only come from the white supremacist social system. It comes from whiteness. And I think the conversation was had, like, in a place which has engaged, which has confronted with the white social system for a long time. They have prepared themselves in defense of like what Jeremiah was saying, in defense of something that has perpetually been under attack. And I think in some ways the documentary and the conversation was a representative of that. We were talking about, what comes out of this world, and how, like, the world today needs to see Baldwin as he is, but not just that, but this way of looking at what does a revolutionary mean at this time? What kind of a revolutionary do we need? Like, does the world deserve today? Where are people at in their consciousness? This is something that I think the world needs to know, which is why I think we say that, the world needs Baldwin, because the documentary brought this up. And, even in the conversation, um, it really seemed like a continuation of last week's free school, which was a short free school, but I think it was very compact, because we were, asking the same question which Jeremiah was raising, the question of, what is the kernel of revolutionary thought which can actually take America forward. And, like, can we talk about capitalism and socialism forever, or do we need to talk about the white supremacist social system that may be producing and reproducing all other relations today? And I think I think especially the conversation about war today and to talk about black poverty, that the fact that you can still talk about war, you can still talk about Palestine and not really have any clue about the city you're living in, to have any clue about how black people live in the city, who are still segregated, and it's never talked about, like the word, it's like the word has disappeared. But you can still talk about it, like, in that way. And I think this is very important, because even when you talk about, King talking about the war in Vietnam, I think there's a tendency to think of, to think of what King's saying, to simply draw the connection between war and economy, to say that, okay, the bombs dropped in Vietnam are exploding in the poor parts of Detroit, but he's also saying it's exploding in the black ghetto. That's what he's also. And I think to not see this connection is, I think, it has to be ideological, it's intentional, where you don't when you want to basically go as far as you can to talk about imperialism, but you really don't want to do anything about whiteness, or you don't want to do anything about black poverty. But I think this conversation was important, and I don't think we have had it yet till last week. So yeah, I wanted to mention it because I think it was a testament to how, like, advanced the event was, and and how Sami Reddy and Pooja, how they like, framed the whole program.
I want to respond to Jeremiah the first time urged to give a history lesson. After the Prophet Muhammad died, the companions of the Muslims, they had to figure out a successor, and there were two sides. One wanted to make the successor the Prophet Muhammad's family, and the others wanted to make the successor the strongest. And so they came to a consensus, and they made the Prophet Muhammad's most trusted companion Abu Bakr the first caliph. And instead of the Prophet's son, because the Prophet didn't have any sons, he only had a son-in-law, Ali, and they had four caliphs, and the fourth was Ali. And then Ali was assassinated, and there was a crisis in the Muslim community because they didn't know how to do the succession again. And the Prophet's grandsons marched from Karbala to, I think it was Medina or Mecca, and on the way they were slaughtered unarmed from Karbala, and their names were Hussein and Hassan. And so this is three generations after the Prophet Muhammad came. And so this is the origins of the Sunni Shia split and the origins of Sunni political quietism. And I think all Muslims agree that the legitimate caliphs, this is the end of the rightly guided caliphs era. All Muslims agree that it was wrong for the Prophet's grandsons to be killed. Um, but the Sunnis believe that they should not have caused a disturbance or a fitna, a political fitna. So this is the origins of Sunni political quietism. And to this day, the Shia, the party of Ali, they self-flagellate on the day to commemorate the murder of the Prophet's grandsons, and that holiday is called Ashura. But just to go back to what Jeremiah said about the Nation of Islam being a state, I would actually compare them more to Hezbollah. Say that they're more dual power situation where they don't want to take over the state, but they want to create a parallel system that supports the people, politically organizes the people, and also, to sort of place the Nation of Islam in Islam. I know we talk about how Mullah's Fard Muhammad, he learned about Islam from Afghan man, who was probably a Ahmadiyya Muslim, and Ahmadiyya Muslims believe that there are prophets who came after the Prophet Muhammad, and they're an oppressed minority in Pakistan, but it's a religion that's from India. But I was looking into the Quran that the Nation of Islam uses, and it comes from I think his name is Mulani Muhammad Ali. He's a man from Lahore who was part of that movement, the Ahmadiyya movement.
From what movement?
The Ahmadiyya
Oh, Ahmadiyya.
religion. And so I don't know all the meaning, but to me it seems that the Nation of Islam is closer to those two movements in Islam than they are to Sunni Islam, because of this idea that no, it's wrong. You should speak out about it. You should speak out about what's wrong politically, in Islam or your country. But also the Islam, the Nation of Islam is closer to is originates from India. It's closer, it's more closer to a South Asian conception of Islam than it is, an Arab version of Islam. And this thought was inspired when Mr. Rodney was talking in his lecture during service. What I don't know what's called either. Service, lecture, sermon. I don't know. Sabbath. He was talking about how you could convert a lot of Muslims, after collapse of the Nation of Islam, converted to Sunni Islam, and you can do that, and then you can follow. You can follow Mecca, you can follow Medina, you can follow Moroccan Islam, you can follow Pakistanis. But what's unique about the Nation of Islam is that they're independent, and they don't. And Minister Rodney was saying. Minister Farrakhan landed in an African country, and they welcomed Minister Farrakhan in all sorts of countries. But when he landed, they told him you can't talk about Mulana Muhammad Ali and you can't talk about Elijah Muhammad because that would put you outside of the fold of Islam. You're talking about prophets outside of Prophet Muhammad. And Minister Rodney, I don't know if Farrakhan said this, but he said, "Now I'm definitely going to talk about those two." And regardless about what I think theologically, he's right that the Nation of Islam is an independent religious organization, and they're independent because they're black. And then he went on to say, "Wow, you can lose your independence, and you can join these Arab people, but are they speaking out for the Palestinians? Have they spoken? Have the Arab countries who are affected by this, Sunni political quietism?" Have they spoken out, for the Palestinians? They've made compromises. And, I think that's what he was trying to say about the Nation of Islam being independent, being a uniquely black religion, is that they never lost, this idea that they're brothers in humanity with the poorest of the poor, the wretched of the earth.
Maybe we can pivot to her giving a presentation on Black social system because I feel like it's coming up.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking also. All of this is connected. So I'm going to try and sort of highlight the well, I want to begin by saying that Namita's essay on colored modernity is very deep and very important for this time because it puts certain questions on the table that this is the moment to try and find answers to. Because, at this period, we are observing a decline of the Western civilization, and therefore the question of modernity, which so far has been overdetermined by ideas of white modernity, is put on the table because in some ways its limitations are becoming clearer now than it ever has been before. And at the same time, if you see the Asian and African people, they are coming into their own. This is a moment when Asia and Africa is coming into its own because youths, and this is the argument that Nanda also makes in the essays that you're one or two generations after the freedom struggles, the anti-colonial struggles in these societies, and the children of or grandchildren of these freedom fighters, maybe for the first time, have been educated in this generation. And what was earlier the rural or the so-called backward parts of this countries are no longer isolated from the world. They know what's happening here in the US, they know what's happening in the Middle East. And so this is the moment where a part of human history, the history of dark people that had been excluded in some ways, from the historical narrative of the world's people as a whole, this is the time for it to come forth and answer questions about what is colored modernity going to look like? Is it going to look white? Or how is it going to resolve all of the questions that are put on the table, which are questions of the state, it's questions of the criterias for art and beauty and civilization. It's also questions of how you see the human being, how you see the modern man and the modern woman, their relationships to each other, but then also the relationship of the individual to a larger whole. Like, what is your responsibility as a modern man and woman to society, to the world, for it to become what it must be? And the primary assertion that this essay makes is that in its path to achieve colored modernity, the people of Asia and Africa are going to become progressively more black instead of white. So the path colored modernity follows will not be the path that white modernity followed. It will look more like the development of the black social system, where black people who were severed from their civilizational ties to Africa and, sort of brought to this place where none of the touchstones they had to their traditions, to their civilizations could really be sustained. They had to forge something new from scratch. And in large parts, it had to be a negation of white supremacy and a white supremacist social system. And its indictment on the human, on humanity itself. And so the essay makes the argument that this is the reason why the black social system, how it developed, what its values were, what makes it unique. This needs to be studied because it holds answers for the question of colored modernity in this moment. And thanks to people like Du Bois, thanks to people like E. Franklin Frazier, Angela Davis, I would even say, like Ananta mentions Amiri Baraka, Paul Robeson, you have an idea of how this development took place, what it was reacting to, but what it was also trying to hold on to. And reading this essay, it also made me think that somebody like Du Bois, the reason why they knew it was so important to record this history or this narrative, it makes me believe that they understood that this is a great experiment that will have something to teach the whole world at one point, because they were forced from a very early stage of their development to immediately have to confront their question. There was no time to wait. Like, in order to survive, you had to be clear on what the truth was and how you saw white society and so on and so forth. And we are lucky enough to have that inheritance to really study, but also take forward for our time. And so in the essay, the part that I think, like, this is really the evidence of what the black social system can contribute to the world right now. And Nanta highlights several different points that make the black social system not only unique but also almost like essential for the question of colored modernity or dark people as a whole, where the first thing is the question that we would also discuss in preschool, the question of the family unit, right? So because of slavery, because you were treated as commodity and bought and sold, none of your family ties or natural familial relationships was ever respected. Definitely not, the rights of a black man to his women and children. To a lesser extent, the mother-child relationship, which to some extent was allowed to, have its own life. But then what this ended up doing was, unlike in Asian and African societies, where the family is really at the center of the organizing principle in some ways of society, for Black people, the family unit could never be that. And even after emancipation, family ties were more or less loose because the man had to go out for work, and what you observed was, to a large extent, Black families were matriarchal with the mother or the grandmother at the head, which is unusual in itself. But that also brings you to the unique characteristic of the Black woman produced through this process of development. And I think this is really my favorite part of those arguments, because obviously because it's also personal to me, where the essay makes the argument that from the very beginning, the Black woman was a worker, equally a worker with the Black man in the plantations. And so, because of slavery, the Black woman was always a part of the workforce. And in some ways, ironically, this freed them of the bonds of patriarchy much more than it freed the traditional Afro-Asiatic woman and definitely the white woman, And I want to read out some parts from the essay where when Nanda talks about Black women. So she says, this means that women in the Black community have always had a consciousness that was qualitatively different from women in the Afro-Asiatic villages. They are assertive and confident. Most notably, their role as equal partners of Black men in the struggle for Black liberation has never been in question. This reflects itself prominently in the relationship between men and women in the Black community. It can be argued that men and women are seen as equal partners, with women often defining the terms of their relationships. Black women have not been a part of the feminist movement for sexual freedom in America because their relationship to Black men does not necessitate such a struggle. Polyandry is not uncommon in the Black community today, with children often being raised by mothers with external support from the father. So it's really, I mean, even conceptualizing the role of the woman like that is very freeing for anybody. But it basically is an assertion that what might have worked in the old, like clan structures or gender roles that are more traditional, could transform into something where men and women are naturally equal partners in the work that has to be done, making, all the pretenses of identity politics movements or feminism seem as hypocritical as they are, because anyway, but I'll come back to this point a little later. But I just think this is a very significant point to draw from the Black social system. And the next thing is, the role of the church, where, like Du Bois says, the church preceded the family on these shores and was everything African. And the Black church or Black theology, in some ways, was religion put to use in struggle in a way that I don't know if any other society has really achieved to that extent, where the church was definitely, it satisfied the spiritual needs of a people that was oppressed, but it also became like the ground at which Black people met to organize for struggle for freedom. And religion and morality, the moral force, moral imperative was organically a part of the struggle for freedom for Black people. And this is why, if you look at so many of the leaders of the Black freedom movement, they either directly were from the church or had deep ties to the church, like somebody like Baldwin, because morality was never kept separate from political method or strategy. It was considered to be as important a part because it informed what you struggle for, right? And okay, so moving on, the next thing that the essay points out is the centrality of the child in the Black social system, where every child is seen to belong to you, whether or not you are the parents of that child. And in some ways, the child is celebrated almost as a promise of the future. Like, as long as there's a child, there is something that you have to fight for, because the only future worth struggling for is a future that's deserving of this child. And in some ways, I think this is also very different from, I'm going to talk about Indian society, but I believe like Asian and African traditional societies also do not have that to that extent, where in Asian Africa there still is, I believe, to some extent, an idea that there's a collective responsibility to children and youth, but the family unit always takes precedence, where your child is always your child and to be put above every other child, even though, you probably take some collective responsibility. So this is an advancement that the Black social system made, where it's not the family unit that's the most important, but it's almost the conception of a whole people, Like whatever happens to this child happens to me, it happens to us as a people, which is very significant. Okay, so the next thing that, yeah,
Even the children of Asia, bombs that drop in Asia drop. Yeah, just
right. So it's not just the black children, but any child anywhere put at threat is a threat to your humanity, to your future, and so on. Okay, so the next thing, and I think this is also really deep, and it took me a while to fully understand the significance of this, which is the conception of the human being within the life, within the Black imaginary, which Nandita asserts is, and this is also what Amiri Baraka says, is the conception of the human being within the Black imaginary is best articulated by the blues. And I want to read a little quote from here, which was very clarifying for me, um, which is, as blues music emerged from more primitive folk and work songs using a language that was distinctly African American, so did the African American people emerge from the Africans in America. So the argument being made here is that the development of the blues follows the development of the African American from the African, and it in some ways then becomes a narrative of the development of the consciousness of the Black human being, and especially within a white society. And I think the points that Nanta highlights about the blues are all very significant, where the first thing she says is that it has to be acknowledged that the blues is essentially a personal, individual music, where it directly is dealing with the aspirations, the needs, but also the disappointments of the individual human being to the society that they're subject to or controlled by, right? But then, even though it's talking about the individual human being, it's not individualistic because it places the human being in the context of a broader people and identifies that there is a shared experience. Like what the individual is experiencing is a shared experience that a whole people, generation after generation, experiences. And therefore, there's also a shared struggle that the individual actually has a responsibility to this collective. And I think this point is important to be made because, well, maybe I'll come to that later, because in some ways it's an antithesis of what white modernity and its emphasis on the individual and individualism tries to establish. And the other thing that she points out about the blues is that it's essentially an urban music. So it's not the folk anymore. It's responding to the needs of man and woman in the context of a modern, urban, industrialized world, which is a different scenario, which raises questions that need to be answered. And okay, so finally, and to me, this is one of the most important contributions that I feel that the Black social system has to make to colored modernity today, which is that it has an understanding and an analysis of the white man. It has an understanding of what values and ideas and assumptions fuel the white psyche, but then it also has a clear understanding of the lies that, the white view worldview has to tell itself and to the whole world in order to constantly impress upon people that we are superior, like we've reached something that all of you must be aspiring to. And when you reach that, that's it, like that's the end of your ideological spiritual journey, is to reach. But no people, like Black people, have been able to have an analysis and understanding, both spiritual but also theoretical, given what Baldwin is saying, what the voice is saying, of the white psyche, of white supremacy, and of white supremacy perpetrated as part of a social system that's over determining. And I think this is very significant, and it goes back to the conversations we've been having in the preschool about the possibility of the white supremacy social system existing elsewhere from America, right? And I think this is at the heart of the contradiction, is that in Asia and America, and Nandita said it in a beautiful way, which is that in Asia and Africa, the white man can be something abstract. Like, you can have some ideas of, oh, these are white values or whatever, but you can be in some way shielded from the deepest implications of what those ideas, what those values do to the human being, what they say about the world, what they say about truth, and so on and so forth. And so that abstraction could make you more susceptible or vulnerable to the penetration of white supremacy as a basis of social organization in your societies. But the black social system has always been the primary bulwark against these ideas, because for their very survival, they had to understand it and then reject it. And so in some ways, to me at least, this feels like one of the biggest contributions that a study of the black social system and a study of the black freedom struggle can inform the world on the questions of colored modernity, because in some ways we are seeing that the principal contradiction for humanity to fight against is whiteness. It is white supremacy, the fact that it overdetermines everything, and so you need to have an analysis of whiteness.
Right.
Okay, so that's the part that sort of works out what in the black social system needs to be studied. And then the essay asks the question, how do you define modernity? What is modern, right? And this question needs to be asked because the answers that have been provided for it have all been from the white perspective. And I think Fukuyama can be considered, and Nanta talks about Fukuyama a lot because in some ways he's articulating what is a collective worldview of white people in general of what modernity looks like. And the conclusion they draw is that it's the ideological move to liberal democracy and then unbounded material progress fueled by science and technology that defines modernity for for the human being. And this is a good time to be talking about it because in this moment, the limitations of that worldview, that framework, have become very apparent. Where if you look at white societies, if you look at the individual within white society, operating on that like vision of white modernity, it's very individualistic, it's very materialistic. People have a lot of investment in like brands and celebrity and I don't even know what the best way to say it, but in some ways, every question that the people are asking themselves within that framework ends up being really shallow because it has to do more with the external than the internal development of consciousness. I think this whole influencer culture and all of that plays into it some ways. It's a very shallow understanding of what the human being is supposed to mean. And we discussed this at length in the science conference, is also white modernity has led you to a crisis of knowledge itself in this country, where the institutions of knowledge production are exhausted. They don't have anything new to offer. They don't even have a conception of the future. And, we've been sort of like talking amongst ourselves about all of the Nobel Prizes that were awarded to both in physics and in chemistry, awarded to AI. That's really like, a declaration of defeat, where you're saying that human beings have come as far as they can come. This is all of the knowledge that we can possibly get at. We've done it, and now it's just going to be the machine. We basically are not responsible for producing anything new, anything revolutionary anymore. And even the claims of like, the rational being the model in some ways, like, oh, the modern man or woman is like not so determined by superstition and backward, like, or religion or all of that, but it's about rational thought. Even that has been called into questions when you see how quick and trigger happy, the ruling class, the elite are, where you're even willing to consider nuclear annihilation because you're so unwilling to develop to believe that there could be other modes of development for human beings. So in all of that to say is that everything that white modernity claims in some ways has been proven to be limited in our time, or is being proven to be limited. And so this raises the question when Fukuyama says that this is the end of history, we've reached it, the white man has reached it. Now we all what we are waiting for is for the whole world to understand that this is where you need to get at and reach there, and that's it. That's the achievement of all of humanity's potential. You have to ask yourself the question, can a worldview, can an ideological framework that sees an end to human history and to human development, can it ever be modern? And in this context, I like that part in the essay where Nandita talks about how when Tagore went to China in 1924, there was a lot of opposition to his visit because there were a lot of young intellectuals and activists whose mindset was that we don't need ancient wisdom, we need Mr. Science and Mr. Democracy, and the West can give us that. And Tagore said, the revolution of spirit in man is truly modern. I am on its side for I am modern. And it's a radically different way to think about the world, where you're saying that it's not your scientific or technological progress that makes you modern. What makes you modern is that you still believe that the human story has not been told yet. Like, it's still being told. There is still a revolution of the spirit yet to come for humanity to be able to articulate itself to a fuller extent. And all of that is modern. There's always going to be the question of modernity as the needs of human beings change with the changing of times, with the changing of social and ideological relationships. And so this basically places once again the moral and the spiritual at the heart of the question of what is the motive force of history, as opposed to what, liberals and Western intellectuals would claim is that it's technological progress or, postmodernism or this and that. And this is also what King said, is if, the moral progress of man lags behind his technological progress, then that will end up in spiritual decay of the human being. And so through all of this, I want to read another part from the essay, which I thought was really beautiful. So Nanda says, we argue, building on Tagore and Martin Luther King Jr., that the motive force of history is not scientific development, but the democratic, emancipatory struggle of the masses of the world's people. Human consciousness of the masses of the people and its struggle to assert itself forms history. It is through this struggle that the human consciousness itself can reach new stages and levels, and science must be harnessed and controlled by spiritual ends of man to become truly revolutionary. So just to go on, I think this definition of history as human consciousness of the masses of people and its struggle to assert itself forms history. I think this is a very, human consciousness of the masses of people and its struggle to assert itself forms history. So history is not like a chronological collection of events of this happened after this. It's the flowering or the articulation of human consciousness in its various stages of development. And modernity has to be seen from that perspective. It cannot just be something that's static in the sense that, oh, this is the end point. If you reach there, you're modern and that's it, right? And I think in this view of history as a narrative of people's consciousness coming into its own, I think this is it's a useful, a clarifying way to be able to explain the world that we are seeing right now, because this history is in the process, as the essay argues, this history is in the process of being written right now. This is how we are supposed to see the rise of Asia. This is what breaks de-dollarization, even the axis of resistance against Israel and the United States in the Middle East is a descriptor of this coming of dark humanity into their own and reaching a stage of consciousness where the questions of the modern man and woman, the questions of the state, the questions of war and peace can be articulated, can be answered without the mediation of the Western world. This is basically it is through this process of writing history that the question of colored modernity will be answered, which is the argument that the essay is making. And another significant thing that I found in the essay was, in some ways, it points to how Francis Fukuyama talks about the end of history. What he's saying is that there is a universal history of man, and that's the white man's history, right? This essay argues the opposite. It says that there is a universal history of man, but it's not the history of the white man, it's the history of dark humanity. And it's still being written, you know? And in the process of writing this history, it will answer questions on colored modernity. And I was saying this to Doc in the morning, you know, in how we say that the black proletariat is the proletariat in its becoming. Reading this essay, it made me realize that the case it is making is also that colored modernity is modernity in its becoming. Because the testimony, the record, the consciousness of dark humanity has so far been excluded and kept out of history, kept out of answering these important questions about modernity and civilization. But now these testimonies are coming to the forefront, you know. And it's coming to the forefront also because of the hypocrisy of white modernity has been laid so clearly out in front of people, where even when the West says freedom and democracy, but then it can't explain why you need so many wars and you need regime changes everywhere for your freedom and democracy to even make sense. The world is watching, and especially if maybe you can put the elites aside, but the masses of people all over the world are watching and they see that this does not have answers for the future. So in some ways, I'll come to I'm reaching a point where I want to summarize some main conclusions that I took away from this essay. The first one would be that it is colored modernity, which is modernity for all people in its becoming. And this is the time to raise these questions and to try and work some of this out. The second assertion that the essay is making, which I talked about before, is that Black people formed or were the first modern colored people because certain questions that are only becoming existential in Asia and Africa today was existential to Black people from the very beginning of their history in the United States as you know, chattel slaves. And so they had both the imperative but also the opportunity to work certain things out that has something to teach the entire world today. And I wanted to go back to, you know, the question of the man and woman within Black society, and then contrast it with some of the narratives that exist in our times about the woman and the man and so on and so forth, where I mean, what Nandita says about Black women never really having felt the need to be part of a feminist movement like that because their relationship to Black men did not necessitate such a protest, I think is very significant. And I think Baldwin also says the very same thing in that interview he did with Richard Goldstein, where he's basically asked questions like, oh, how does it feel to be like a Black gay man or whatever? And in some ways, he rejects all of it. He says, I've always been troubled by the word gay. I never felt the need to put a label on what it is that I feel towards men and women or stuff like that. And then he also says this thing that was, I thought was very significant, where he says that Black people in general, have a greater capacity for experience, which makes them predisposed to understand complexity as complexity without feeling the need to label everything to death, categorize everything to death. You can just accept that, you know, human beings come in many different shapes and form, and love comes in many different shapes and forms, and it's not tied to sexual identity, you know. And just to contrast that, I showed Doc this essay that the New York Times did about how Harlem Renaissance was as gay as it was Black, you know? And so they go through a list of people, all of these people, Ma Rainey, Bessie Smith, all these people.
And here's half of them. They don't know what these people's sexual preferences were. It's just reputed.
Yeah.
But anyway, I'll shut up.
No, and that's it. Like I was telling Doc, is that the only thing they talk about Bessie Smith is that she was bisexual. And it's such a contrast from what Baldwin says about Bessie Smith, where he talks about poverty. He talks about, you know, the real struggle of being a Black person, um, having to deal with just like the human devastation of not just yourself but your whole people. But of course none of this like features anywhere in the gay narrative about the Harlem Renaissance, and they definitely don't see that the Harlem Renaissance, what it was about, was colored modernity asserting itself, trying to answer questions about what the human being is going to mean, what man, woman, their relationships, but their relationships to the world, what is it going to mean in modern times, unmediated by white values and white standards. That's how I see the Harlem Renaissance. And I remember that was the substance of Emily's presentation from the science conference, is it's civilizational, it's about modernity. It's like to try and sort of silo it into the categories of identity clearly shows how desperate and lost this section of the ruling elite and intellectuals have become, because they have no way to understand the Harlem Renaissance on its own terms, so they have to impose all these terms on it to distort it in some ways. Because I also think secretly that there must be an element of them being jealous. Like how is it that you were able to transgress all these limitations that we placed on ourselves? How is it that you were able to think about the man and woman and not be bound by what we are bound by? How dare you? I get that sense a lot. This need to queer Baldwin, this need to queer everything comes from that not being able to accept how can you be free when I'm not, but yes, so one of the assertions of the essay being that the Black social system has something to say to the question of colored modernity in this time and has to be studied, taken seriously. And then the last thing that I want to talk about is how I think the example of the Black social system and the resistance that it put up against the white social system also places a responsibility on colored people everywhere to take up that same struggle in some ways. And this relates to the conversation we were having last week about the white supremacist social system in Asia and Africa and so on. I think what I'm trying to say is that it's not just enough to study the Black social system and identify what makes it unique in its constitution, but also to understand that what they did is also a demand of like people in Asia and Africa, but then also immigrants in this country, for them to see themselves as a part of a long line of people who have struggled to make the testimony of dark people to be a part of universal human history, who have struggled against white supremacy for, the best of the revolution of the spirit of the Asian and African to become part of human knowledge, human consciousness. I think because you inherited that and because you benefited from that, it becomes the responsibility, the moral imperative of every person from Asia and Africa, in this country or elsewhere, to consider themselves seriously as soldiers in this struggle to bring down the white supremacist social system. And in some ways, it's equivalent to the non-violent struggle that Black people waged against American society in general in order to transform it. I think dark humanity as a whole has to take up the nonviolent struggle against white supremacy, the penetration of white ideas and values into their own societies. Because while we are making the assertion that colored modernity is modernity in its making, it's not a given. It's not a given that we will necessarily reach that point unless you take seriously the counter revolution against it, unless you take seriously how much white ideas, white ideology has penetrated into Asia and Africa. It's not a given at all. It's something that needs to be struggled for. And it's what people before us have struggled for, but they left us with this task to continue the struggle, because it's like Nash said, is that you don't just win freedom. Every generation has to fight for its freedom over and over again. Yeah, those were just some of my thoughts. I think some other stuff might come back to me, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, the essay will be published in Avant-Garde's next issue, so it's not available yet, but it will be soon.
Well, I really wish to thank you for explaining this article. I said to Nandita when I was speaking to she and Raju on the phone this past week that in reading the essay, I hadn't finished it when I was speaking to her. I said because it was so moving that I had to stop and think and so on. And it's moving for me because it is a tribute to the Black struggle. I mean, it really is. And for a woman from and in India, to see all of this is quite striking. I agree. I agree with her. And I think, frankly, I think that her thesis is the Du Boisian thesis. And it is one of the pillars of the book Souls of Black Folk. That I think Du Bois says in essence that if there is to be democracy, and he would ultimately extend it to world democracy, it would have to look different than the West. And I agree with you, and I agree with Nandith, that there's anyone that doubts at this moment that white modernity is failing and has failed the majority of people, no group less than the African American people. And that's part of what the documentary brings out, that Western modernity and capitalism have failed us. And this, I was struck by you saying the envy and jealousy of the white world towards Black people. All of our achievements, they attempt to diminish or claim that they were in one or another way responsible for them.
Right.
By the way, I'm a little hesitant. I was very excited to go see this documentary on the Philly Sound, but it's not on the Philly Sound as much as it is on Sigma Sound Studio.
Right.
I think, okay, we can handle that later. When the question is not the technology or the sound studio, but who are these artists? This imagination, this Black proletarian imagination. But at the end of the day, for the white world and white elites, their question is, how can you think when we can't? How can you produce a Baldwin when we can't?
Right.
Or Du Bois when we can't? Or Robeson or any of this, How have you all, with very, very little, produced a work like E. Franklin Frazier's study of the Black family, which is really a study of the Black social system? I get the idea from drawing upon E. Franklin Frazier's study of the Black family as a way to study the Black social system, the Black system of values. And here I completely agree with Nanda that for Black folk, it has been a long march to construct an alternative modernity. We were not supposed to succeed, and we're still not supposed to succeed. Everything is done to guarantee we fail.
Right.
And for this reason, I think our critique and defining the Democratic Party as the spearhead of white supremacy, an idea that is now, I think, getting some currency as Black folk move away from the Democratic Party and could be the reason, I think they will be the reason, that Kamala Harris will not win. And it is, to use the language, a form of payback. We gave you our best and you took us for granted. And now we don't have any more to give to you. Whatever the future is, we will have to decide it. And I think that is the spirit that is animating the Black community. And, I just wanted to say, we've been going around North Philly and studying it and looking at the boundaries of what is the Black community. And these are boundaries. How do you explain that in neighborhoods where Black people live, it's damn near 100% Black people? Now this is after 400 years.
Right.
After 150 years after, the end of slavery. And still, Black folk, unlike any other group of people, are cordoned off from the rest of society. And every problem, and this is Du Bois' sociology, every problem of modern America can be understood best by understanding the Black community. If you want to understand poverty, don't just study study Black poverty. It is the definition of it. If you want to understand racism as an set of institutions, you must study Black people. But I think this idea of the Black social system, I know Ban Dong is going to read, and I think, by the way, Du Boisian sociology is different than sociology. In any university, the white sociological, what they call imagination, is an apologia for the white social system. Du Bois was the opposite, and hence it was a study of the capacity of Black folk. Last thing, I shared, I think, with Purba and other people, this, and I, with Jerry, and others, this lecture by a man who is a intellectual, theoretical leader in the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist. It's worth listening to because he lays out pretty much what Marxism, Leninism is, and what it seeks to understand. But maybe halfway through or 2/3 through the essay, you become aware that he has hit a brick wall. First of all, the British have never been known for producing revolutionary thinking. Never. Even back in the days of the World Communist Movement, nobody thought they were more than kind of social democrats, weak. I mean, no great contribution, no great anything, no great thought. So here to reclaim Marxism, Leninism in this way, in the ways that he does it, overlooks the precise thing that Nanditha does, which you brought out, Purba, the Black proletariat. And all of these questions, for instance, you take the origin of the family, private property in the state, a great work as far as it goes. But the family, as constructed among Black people, with its multiple, and I mean marital meaning, ways of establishing um, genealogy. For example, by male-centered monogamy, we mean that one man, one woman, but children's genealogies based upon their connection to the father, because the father could own property. You know, it's a bourgeois concept. You can't use that thinking to explain the Black family. I mean, you do better reading Toni Morrison's Beloved, which we could talk about, or reading E. Franklin Frazier with all of these testimonies of people who were enslaved. Take the question of religion, where Du Bois says, on these shores, the Black church, which he meant, you know, these religious or spiritual gatherings of Black people on the plantation, precedes the Black family. In other words, before we could have families or consolidate as families, the thing is, by the way, you couldn't have families, even though you could have a matriarchal structure, because the plantation owner would determine whether your child would be sold. And Toni Morrison explores this in the book Beloved, by the way. And then there was breeding. Some women and men were, quote, breeders. This was after the transatlantic slave trade ended. But if one looks at all of the questions of white modernity and their claims, you have to flip them if you're talking about Black folk, even up to this day, which I think is why it has been valuable for us to go around Philadelphia, and we have to do it more, to see what it looks like. And I would just, this is the last thing I'd say, listening to this lecture interview, you go away with the sense that this man has no idea of the world that he lives in, which is going through fundamental and almost revolutionary change. And what Nanditha said is that the trajectory of modernity, of dark modernity, colored modernity, looks more like what Black modernity looks like. And that Black modernity, contrary to the, you know, quote, Marxist Leninist, I put quotes around there, doesn't even factor in to the discussion. And you ask yourself, I know none of the, how is it possible with all of this, with the music, with the art, with the struggle, with the resistance, with yada, 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 with all of this, you still don't see it. You know, we, just like you go to Mos 12 or you go to Zion Baptist Church, it's like you're in the free school practically. You know, I mean, you talk about Baldwin and we're all on the same page, you know? I hope nobody from Central Branch of Free Library is listening. But okay, you go to Making Worlds Bookstore. Why is it so difficult to get on the same page?
Right.
You just, I mean, it's always like every week you come there, you got to fortify yourself to enter into some kind of struggle, not openly, passive aggressively, you know, the questions that are asked, for example, you know, which are not, well, anyway. But the thing is, Black folk are invisible, totally invisible, or at least they want to claim that. And thus, the concept, and Nonetheless is right, there is but one path left to humanity, and that is European or white modernity. And I think that us continuing this conversation, not for academic purposes, but to consider the capacity of the American people to transform themselves in a great, and this is why I think our formulation, revolutionary, democratic, and emancipatory struggle, this is the task to undo the white supremacist social system and its assumptions. Its assumptions, more, maybe sometimes more than the actual structures of it, institutions of it, the assumptions of it. Because if you adopt the assumptions, it is easy then, even if it's at the elite level. We talk about this in China, we talk about it in India. Even at the elite level, adopt the assumptions of the white supremacist social system, and call it democracy, of course, like a democratic movement in Hong Kong. Well, why all y'all talk English and act white?
Right.
If it's, you understand where I'm coming from? Or why in Bangladesh? What are you overthrowing? And why? But the assumptions, which are the foundation of the ideological struggle, must be seen and must be undone. Here, of course, the struggle this is, I guess you could say, the mother of the struggle against white supremacy. This is where the conflict already is at a very high level. And we see it in Black folk, where they understand, maybe not our language, but they understand as a people, we face a system. And this is everything. This means everything. And just, I know Kathy and Michelle talking about the Philadelphia Sound. I think y'all going to discover the peace and freedom dimensions.
A civilization of peace.
Oh, good. I'm sorry.
No.
Yeah, go
Wait,
ahead.
actually,
No, you go ahead.
I think you should complete your thought because I'm trying to.
No, I did.
That's it? Okay.
I guess I did.
Well, I think the only thing I would say is because there's so much I'm still absorbing. You've done such a great job of bringing all these pieces that Nandita's put together, and I'll say that as the more the beauty of also even being able to talk about the blues in it's not just music, as we've been saying, or has Bowen said. It's also ideological. It's representative of something so much greater, the development of a people that has so much to teach the world, and I think by extent, but we also mean the whole of the American people. And as we're putting together the framing of this interview, which has actually become deeper every time you look at it, which makes the scope of it broader and more complex, we found ourselves having to actually face the challenge of defining what we mean by this is R&B and jazz, especially the Philly sound, is a highly modern music coming from a modern people. But actually, we were in that stage of like, we have to start to define this because there's such a battle over what it means to be like modern, because there's so much of a claim European and white modernity has like, and modernism has made to some of these, this discourse, and what we're saying and inserting is different, and we just want to make that clear. And we're still in the process of doing that. And I just feel so indebted to how Nanda has worked some of this out in a really, thorough way that has advanced our thought. And I feel like I want to rethink so much of how we might approach this, or not rethink it so much as just deepen just that, because it is connected to what we are talking about in terms of what is it that all of the long march to construct colored modernity, which we see when you go to North Philly, both imagining what it was like, the height, the ascendancy of the civil rights movement, the Black freedom struggle, that in and of itself, and then also all of this deindustrialization, this all-out attack on youth and music and culture and struggle and what even like poverty, everything, and so one of the biggest the assertions we do want to make is how like all this music is a product, and I think this is your formulation, almost 100 or many centuries of blood and death and sacrifice to even produce jazz, which I think is what Amiri Baraka actually like ties so well to like the development of like first how did the African American emerge out of the African? It is through all these stages and all of these. It's actually very ideological, in fact. But you could. It's more than even just genres emerging, because I think that's something that we've discovered in our article. Now I apologize for going so much into this, but so often we view R&B and jazz, but also gospel, and also what is it, like all of like so like blues and so like, distinct, like different genres that you can select for different whatever, but actually it's all very much an expression, a very shared expression of this music. And you can tell because so many of these musicians first came from the church, like playing the trumpet or the drums or the piano in a church, but then also breaking into like, jazz, playing alongside John Coltrane. And then later on you find them, like you could call it like a third career, but it's really one career, like producing music at like Norman Conway, like at at like the Philly Sound alongside Tom Bell. And it's like, that's one human being. That person did not see those three things as three things in some ways, although there were distinctions, of course. And I think that's what Amiri Baraka also does really well. It is based on historical stages of like a people. Yes, everything African at one point also living on the land and plantations, and then the Great Migration transforming the character and the struggle in many ways, so that something more modern, like the questions have, like the crises have developed, that like jazz therefore like answers or addresses different questions maybe than even like the spirituals at one point when they first emerged. But it's not as if the spirituals went away. Like there's a lot there, and all of these are just such rich ideas that I think, I guess to take it back for a moment, like we're just trying to find the best way, I think, to lay out. Bunny single. Wait,
Just say, I don't know, man.
Well, there's so many people that this.
North Philly, but I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, I think there's just so many people. It's also paying tribute to essentially people who have not been acknowledged from the Black Rotarian, like. And also this music as philosophers and also like innovators of such an original sound that actually so much of the world actually, their idea of what is like R&B or funk or like modern music actually comes from the Philly sound. And some artists like directly recognize this, but most of the time it never goes acknowledged as the product of North Philadelphia. And like, I mean, there's so many different tastes that I feel like you're bringing up funny music. There's so many people that we, like, and also the beautiful thing about all this music is that it's so collective. Like it took, yes, we like now have also come to really recognize the beauty of these frontline, versatile, like male singers with like what we call a falsetto voice, but we've deepened that in many ways. Like Russell Tompkins Jr. of the Stylistics, William. Bougie Hart Muhammad, like of the Delphonics, but also it was the lyricists that work behind, the arrangers, the orchestra, everybody together. And I have a feeling that that documentary will probably only be able to thread some of this together and may entirely miss, I think, the point of what this music was about.
Yeah,
but
the imaginary,
I haven't seen it yet. I haven't watched the trailer for it. I was excited to see it. It's brand new. I think it's premiering at the Philly Film Festival this in 2 weeks or so. But it's very interesting. This is becoming. These are very important questions that the documentary is coming up now, of all times. People do feel as if Philly is something special, but for what reason, I suppose, is the other question.
Can I just,
I don't know if I've taken us off.
no, can I just say something quick, if you don't mind? How this music also is intertwined with the artists. For instance, Barbara Bullock, Andrew Turner, Barclay Hendricks, Richard Watson. All of these people are part of the same moment in history in the same city, you know, and how it is manifested in the painters. For example, Barbara Bullock's Jasmine Garden body of work, or her other work, or Richard Watson and what's his name, the other Walter Edmonds, those great murals, you know, that come in the mid 70s. The mid 70s, Philly Sound, John Coltrane, all of that going on. And so many of these people, for example, Barbara Bullock hung out at Ile Ife, but also at Sunrise House. You know what I'm saying? So this rich and beautiful landscape, which we're now, seeing, we're fortunate to be able to see, to connect with such artists as Barbara and Richard, and to see the works of others. I think this is really beautiful. And then I know, the interview that Michelle and Kathy and yeah, well, yeah, but it was because I mentioned Bunny Sigler, and there's a brief documentary on him which we should look at, by the way. And Bunny Sigler's right from what today they call Northern Liberties, or we used to call Pentown, and they, or Billy Paul, his body of music, and Billy is from the original Tenderloin. I mean, really, there's a thing known as the original Tenderloin where it began, and Spanky DeBress, his crib in Richard Allen Projects, with John Coltrane and McCoy, all of them were there. So I mean, it is almost, I guess, if I could speak for you, Kathy, it's sometimes breathtaking. And I know you and Michelle trying to pull it all together is something, but I think Nunditha has something. And we could see it in our studies and our, whatever, here in Philadelphia. But it does demonstrate, and this is its connection to the revolutionary and democratic struggle. It shows a high capacity. And you can go anywhere. You can go up to the Nation of Islam, like we were up there last week. The same thing. It's the same feeling, the same sense of art, of beauty, of music, of struggle, of oppression. It's all the same thing. And I know, I think it's Michelle who said to me, I guess both of you all are working this out, how the Philly sound is so anchored to the struggles for peace and justice. Isn't it? And love. That the peace thing is so deep. I don't care whether it's Hal Melvin and the Blue Notes, whether it's, I don't know who else, Poochie, the Delphonics and them, or Billy Paul. Peace and justice is pronounced in it. So it is philosophical, as you said. Philosophy expressed through art.
I was just gonna briefly say, not to take things back to where we started. Actually, that was something when I watched the documentary. I really, the part that really stood out to me was actually like the part that focused so much on like the artists and the painters, but also the poets. Like, I really liked Aaron Douglas and Romare Bearden was like sewn throughout. And actually, the tendency that I think that I think we've noticed in the treatment of especially avant-garde jazz by now an increasingly like interested white educated elite audience is like almost like fetishizing how just like out there and radical and just you know extreme like those the heights of yes like technical and musical like experimentation but you cannot really understand like John Coltrane as a singular individual genius. You cannot understand like I'm trying to think of another art, but like Romare Bearden as like a single you can't even understand Baldwin as a singular individual, and that's what they like to do. I'm realizing it's much easier to deal with individual like black genius, or even just like, or you can massage or like queer them in a way that therefore isolates them from a larger sense of struggle. Their people are also what produced them from North Philly, from the fact that it was all so, I don't know if interconnected is the right word, but or fluid. It's even more, I think, ideological than that. That all
What do you mean more ideological than
I
that?
think it's that it's not just like Black people produce such varied cultural different like they have this and that they have it's actually I don't see it as just it's a diverse body of thought. I see it as like the questions are being asked and being addressed in many different ways, but it was all very no, I feel as if we talked about something of this sort, like in terms of how like broad like the body of thought, the discourse really is proletariat. That's really what I mean, because I think it's easy to call it, I guess.
And the capacity to deal with complexity, with contradiction, with nuance, with emerging things, with newness,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to touch you.
No. Well, yeah, no, I appreciate you talking through Nandita's essay, and yeah, I'm very excited for her and essays for putting together for the issue, and I think part of, I guess the assumptions that go into it, or which are also the assertions that go into it, are why do you need a colored modernity in the first place? Why call it colored modernity? What is the need for it beyond just even describing a phenomenon? And I think part of it is that, yeah, for the rest of the world, yeah, for the rest of the world, to become modern has been basically equated with becoming Western and therefore also becoming white. And I think this is something which is very much underestimated. And I think part of it is like, yeah, because we were reading Du Bois' essay, The Souls of White Folk, in Darkwater this past week in our reading group. And yeah, part of it is like, Du Bois in that period is making sense of the First World War.
Yes.
And he's like, what caused this? And I feel like this is a very, like, at this point that's become very almost common knowledge of like, like kind of the inter-imperialist rivalry, the kind of search for colonies and the battle over the colonies, which like Du Bois is explaining, but that in many ways he's also, Du Bois has that kind of famous formulation of the problem of the 20th century being the problem of the color line. And in Darkwater and Souls of White Folk, he's kind of, in many ways, looking ahead to what will be the kind of battleground and the stage of struggle, not just in the United States, but around the world. And he's basically saying, like, it is going to be this striving of all of the peoples who have been named as darker and as inferior by the West, and their struggle to be free, and their struggle to, as you were saying, to realize themselves. And yeah, I think part of what I think is going to be, I guess, interesting and difficult, and just part of the terrain of the struggle is like you were saying, Nanit also makes this point in her essay, but it's like, yeah, like simultaneously, the white man is an abstract concept because you don't really have. I mean, like obviously there are like white people who go abroad, and I think in many ways it's more concrete when you have to deal with the colonial question during the 20th century. But it's like, yeah, how do you on the one hand kind of like make it a concrete kind of thing to struggle against when you don't directly have like the white man in your society, and yet you're being penetrated simultaneously by the influence of the West and by what we call like the white supremacist social system. So I think that's part of it, and I think too, like, I have more. But yeah, I guess the other kind of assumption that goes into it is, in some ways, like Miko is both responding to the kind of the liberal kind of framing of with like Francis Fukuyama, but also maybe not as directly, but still also responding to the Marxist kind of epistemology. And I think, yeah, like I know that there's like, I'm not trying to do this thing of saying like, oh, like Marx and Engels were racist or whatever, but it is true. They carry Western civilization assumptions, and you can see it very clearly in like how they talk about like even like the creation of the world market through capitalism and through essentially the expansion of Europe's kind of industrial revolution and bringing that to the rest of the world. Where yeah, like Marx and Engels will say very clearly, we have, like they're kind of ambivalent about it, but still overall positive and being like, yeah, like we have like what Europe has done is, yeah, like brought civilizations like China and India by essentially snatching like the kind of, yeah, quote unquote Asiatic mode of production. And it's like not to even like, I don't know, be like, oh, like they're so racist, but they do carry certain civilizational assumptions. And I think too, oh, the other thing that I meant to say was this question that's brought up by Tagore, which Nanda deals with, of yeah, like the motive force of history, but especially like what drives history, especially in a modern, with the arrival of what we call modernity. I think part of what we're arguing is that, and like Doc has made this point before, like earlier this year, that in many ways this ushering in of modernity, of also of like freedom for like the world's majority through the anti-colonial struggles and also the socialist movements has made it more, basically like this has made it more possible for people's consciousness to play an ever more definitive role in the movement, in the forward movement of history. And I think, yeah, this is also something which is not totally understood by the Marxists. Because, yeah, I watched the video that you sent,
Yes.
the British guy, and like the thing is like, it's because I think part of what, and Todd, I also saw Todd sent this video in the comments, but yeah, part of I feel like what the world is trying to deal with is like, okay, like how do you explain, yeah, like the Israeli genocide in Gaza? How do you explain the Western unequivocal unanimous support for the genocide in Gaza and for Israel? And like this is something we're talking about, but like there's many ways that you can explain it, and there's like the economic, there's this question of the oil, there's this question of geopolitics, and you can also even say, I think there's many people who are like, oh, like the West is purely driven by ideology, which I think is also partially true, but I think what is not really understood or seen is it's not just the like the Western elites are driven by ideology, although that's true, but it's like what we're trying to make sense of is when we talk about civilization, we're talking about a total way of life and a total social system, which is in many ways what we've been trying to make, like to grapple with. And I think it's not yet been made clear that this question of war, which like we've like been trying to work out for the past couple of weeks in preschool, like what drives the war and what drives like specifically the case of the genocide in Gaza is not just even the elites, but it's also the product of the social system. And yeah, I don't feel like I fully like worked it out yet, but I just feel like that's something which is not really seen in a similar way that it's like, oh, why don't they see the black? And I think that's also like an interesting question in and of itself, because it's like both there's this thing of like, oh, people don't want to see black people, but it's also this is product of, like we said, a counter revolution, which is very deliberate and which has taken place. But it's like there's kind of this simultaneous thing where I think in many ways like people around the world recognize like black culture as like a unique phenomenon and maybe are not sure entirely what to make of it, but then it gets kind of displaced onto just being like, oh, black culture is like hip hop. Basically, and like that becomes the sum total of how you see black people. So in some ways, it would be a question of like, yeah, like whereas certain elites in like India, for like Indian society, will have come to the United States and brought back essentially like a white view of the world, a white way of behaving. I think in many ways, like part of I feel like what Namrata and Raju are doing is like we come back to our civilization in our society with a different message. And this is the message of actually of black people. And yeah, those are just like some thoughts. But yeah, I think like what she's working on is very important.
I also wanted to like this question, like why do we even need to talk about colored modernity? I think one part of the essay that I didn't touch upon was how Nanta talks about, well, she's talking about what Baldwin says about this, but the relationship between time and history, and the idea that, or the fact that colored modernity might not have been at the forefront of, like, I don't know how to put it, like the fact that this is not being answered yet does not make it any less of an important question to answer now, because this question of time and history keeps coming back, like even in the part in Fire Next Time where Baldwin is talking about Elijah Muhammad, he's
Even before that, in the first couple pages of Down at the Cross, that's what in sign with the time and history, time, history, and love. He put it, didn't he? No, I'm sorry, but yeah, I'm sorry.
No. Yeah, and I mean, I remember the part about Elijah Muhammad because I recently revisited it before the mosque event. But what he was trying to say is that it's not like Elijah Muhammad came up with something entirely new, but it was the right time for these ideas to be communicated to the masses. It was the right time, and this is me putting in my words that it was the right time because there was a movement afoot also where these questions were being put on the table. And so certain ideas, like the existence of a black god that will free you where the white god did not, in the context of an existing movement for the freedom of black folk, it becomes the right time for those ideas to really take a hold of people where maybe in the past it did not. And I think that's the same argument that Nanta is making in this essay where she quotes from Staggerly Wonders.
Oh boy.
And I just want to read some parts because I feel like the formulations are important, where the part of the poem that I want to read out is where Baldwin is saying, Lord, history is weary of her unspeakable liaison with time, for time and history have never seen eye to eye. Time laughs at history, and time again, time traps history in a lie. And then I want to read this paragraph
Can I ask you a question? Can you explain that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I can
Go ahead,
explain
Abhi.
it. I can explain it in the way Baldwin explains it,
Go ahead.
where in Fire Next Time, what he's saying is that time catches up with history and it crushes empires by crushing the assumptions of empire. And it takes like that period of working that out, of negating the ideas that need to be negated, might take time and need the correct time or so on and so forth, but it always catches up, like time and history can never really avoid each other, and time reveals what is true in history and what is not. And let me read this part because I thought this was very well written and clarifying, where what she's saying is Baldwin is asking us to question the lie that the white world has contorted history into. Baldwin is telling us that time, which reflects the reality of the darker world, has never accepted the way in which history is made to parade in order to justify their oppression. Darker people all over the world will reject in time the notion that they must catch up to Western liberal democracy. Hence, for thinkers such as Baldwin and Du Bois, European and white modernity is built upon the exploitation of the darker world, and the claim of Western superiority rests on the denial of this fact. Fukuyama analyzes Hitler as an anomaly in the trajectory of Western history, while Du Bois and Baldwin saw Nazism as a logical extension of white supremacy and colonialism. One wonders, and I think this is really significant, one wonders how Fukuyama understands today the Israeli state, maybe as another anomaly.
Yeah. Well, I think it's like even if maybe the problem of whiteness is not as acute in other societies as it is in the United States, I think part of the underlying dynamic of what's been unfolding over the past year, it's like, yeah, like how do you explain not just the behavior of the Israeli regime, but also the behavior of Western elites and why they're so invested in the project of Israel, and why also many, for instance, like Americans are invested in the question of Israel, not just even Jews, but also Christian, is because it's like through the specific slaughter of the Palestinians, you are sending a message to the rest of the colored world. You're saying, this is what we can potentially do to you. And this is where it becomes not just, like you're saying, it becomes not just like this question of colored modernity becomes, it's not just like, oh, like a nice thing to talk about or consider. Where it's like, oh, like that would be nice if we were to do that. It becomes actually a task. It becomes a world historic task. And it becomes a task for each people in their society. And how it will, I think, unfold in each particular country. Like obviously, there's like we're talking about billions of people around the world, and I don't think we should underestimate that. But how it should unfold, and I think in many ways, it's like, yeah, it seems like in particular, not many of the Arab country governments, but many of the Arab peoples and the Muslim peoples around the world are waking up to this of like, yeah, we have to deal with this question of the West. We have to deal with this question of like, yeah, what does our own civilization mean? And I think it's one thing, because I feel like it's one thing to just say the path to like modernization is not Western, but it's another thing to put that in practice. Because I think like China has also said this very often, like, oh, like modernization does not just mean Westernization, but I think it's another thing entirely. Like, how do you really put that in practice, and not just as something which is like nice to consider, but actually something which is an urgent and world historic.
But that's, oh, sorry.
Just continuing that, this world historic, I guess, advancement of the darker peoples of the world with Black America is dealing with the problem that I have seen in different forms. Even like, for example, when I go to Mexico, it's really stark because there's like people riding horses and there's people driving cars. And so like this physical manifestation of this conflict between tradition and modernity. And there's not the presence of the white man in Mexico like there is in America. But there's this sense amongst like older people that they don't want to even like adopt certain technologies because they feel it's an affront to their humanity in a certain way. It's an affront to their human values. And so on the outside, it just looks kind of backwards, like, hey, man, that's a lot of work, dog. Keeping your chickens, keeping your cows, keeping your lamb, that's a lot of work, man. And they live like this in this more agricultural way to try to hold on to that. And that's something that even gets, I feel like, translated towards like immigrants. When you come to this country, you try to like insulate yourself from white people in your like own like ethnic communities, and maybe you have your child who speaks good English be your interface. But that's certainly not enough on the global stage for those countries, and it's not enough for the children even. And so you see, very tragically, let's say the children of immigrants, like dark people, they're some of like the whitest people you know, and you're like, man, why you're not made for this? Why are you like this? And it's like this I don't want to say deficiency, but or shortcoming, but this advancement that I would say that Black America was able to do, even though they were completely cut off to the fullest capacity of the white world from their, you could say, traditional society and traditional life from Africa, was that there's this relationship towards whiteness, white America, that they had to contend with in their development to decide who they are going to be. And so, like for example, there's no saxophones in Africa, but John Coltrane is able to pick up that saxophone, and that is one of the greatest weapons to overcome white supremacy in this society. And so that things that come even from the West, you can make it onto yourself because it is in struggle, and so it's still it's still an unanswered question, like in the macro, even for this country, on what college modernity is. But what Black America has worked out, I haven't seen it anywhere else. And at the very least, every people I think has to take this orientation towards struggle as part of who they feel they are. If you view yourself as part of a struggle in wherever you are and connected to other people, then I think that is the only way for there to even be a march towards a new human being, a new modernity that can face the present reality and go towards the future.
Can I just make a suggestion? So that we, this question of time and history, it's in the poem Stagger Lee, it's in the essay Down at the Cross, and it's very central to Baldwin. Let us return to it.
Okay.
Even in,
I just,
even in
I,
the interview.
It's in everything. Yeah, I wanted to like add a little more to this line of thinking Jeremiah and Eddie were on. How that's also what I was trying to say at the end of my presentation. It's not just that, oh, there's the idea that colored modernity has to be achieved and it will be good when it is. But it's an actual struggle that people have to take up. And I think that consciousness is lacking to some extent. And in some ways, what this essay does very boldly is to place that responsibility on people to really, like, even when you consider all these Indian intellectuals in academia, you know, it cannot be this easy for you to basically abdicate your responsibility to what produced you and become white. It cannot be this easy because what produced you also placed a responsibility on you to keep fighting for that truth that was discovered through the freedom struggle to see the light of day in every generation that comes. So if you become white and you adopt like post-colonial theory and the subaltern theory and whatever, all of that, you're actually actively anti-revolution because not even Doc pointed this out. It's not even counter-revolution in the same sense that it's anti-revolution, where you are in some ways directly attacking what exists, what gives people their capacity, but you also believe that revolutions are not necessary. Like, you don't need that anymore. Like, you've reached a place where you were supposed to reach, and that's it. And one last thing that I want to say is, like, going back to what Kathy and Doc you were discussing about what comes organically out of that imaginary, like how you can say that Philly sound, it has an organic predisposition to the struggle for peace.
Yeah.
You know?
I'm sorry.
No, yeah,
Yes.
and similarly, I think what Nandita is arguing here, that Du Bois and Baldwin saw that the logical conclusion of white supremacy is colonialism, it
Yes.
is Nazism,
It's war.
it's war,
Yeah.
How is it that
Yeah.
that is not said more? The fact that you can't explain away the genocide or the Holocaust in Germany as a, oops, this was an accident, this is not where we were supposed to go. Maybe this is, are we allowed to really confront that this is probably exactly where you were supposed to go with these ideologies? And this question she poses is that, oh, can Fukuyama explain away what Israel is doing as yet another anomaly? And how long are you going to keep doing this, where whenever excesses are committed in the name of white supremacy, in the name of white civilization, how long are you going to explain it away by saying, oh, this is different? This is not part of the main body of work. Can we start saying that this is the logical conclusion? Nuclear annihilation is the logical conclusion of a worldview that sees in a very narrow way only one path for humanity, and if it is deviating from that path, it's a danger and a threat and a risk to the world, and it has to be eliminated.
Yeah.
Can I just say one, just a lot, the concept logical conclusion, I think is too deterministic.
Right.
I think even in the framework of Western civilization, all of this was a possibility, which then was kind of decided by
By the
what
choices.
human being, that's right. So, which brings the moral into the equation, the collapse of morality. And this is what we see in this Gaza thing.
Well, let me rephrase,
Okay,
because
yes,
I
yes,
think
yes.
what I mean by saying logical conclusion is the choice, the human choice, or the moral choice of whiteness
Yes.
is also the choice of war.
Yeah.
And
I think you're right.
That's
You're probably right.
but you're right.
I can
Is
hear
that the
what you're saying.
possibility always exists that you choose differently, and Black people chose differently.
Yeah, well,
I think what you just said is pretty interesting because I guess I'm thinking about, determinism, or like, is there only one set path for the future? Who gets to say so? And I guess like freedom and necessity in that too, like both what is necessary for the future, what is needed, but then also, the freedom to choose, and then the possibility of multiple, like many different paths of development or possibilities for the future.
yeah. The anti-Nazi path was always present.
Possible,
The
yeah.
anti-genocide is always present.
Yes.
But you would not. I'm sorry.
Yeah. And I think something else that I was thinking about through this conversation is, I guess, in some ways, the materialist view of history and the material necessity of like development or like modernity in that sense, where there is a need for like modern technology, like modern science, like even economic development on a basic human level. And in that sense, like we do live in a modern world where that is necessary for, like in some ways it is necessary. Like the living as like an agricultural like peasant and like milking your cows by hand is possible, but in some ways it's not the highest possible form of like human life.
Right.
But then I think the problem with like Western materialism and the assumptions of it are the assumptions that I think the unquestioned assumption that modern technology, science, and economic development must also come with corresponding Western values. And that if like the line of logic is that the material conditions produce the social conditions, and it's only like unidirectional in that way, then as countries modernize, they must also become socially like Western. And I think that is now like what is questioned and challenged and must be.
Yes.
But I think the fact of Black people in America as like the first example or the proof of the possibility of colored modernity, I think challenges other countries and other civilizations to thus also find their principled way, not to eliminate or like say that the material economics and like the values are completely separated, but to find some independence and some human agency in that fact, which is to say that actually you can resist white supremacy, like you can resist like crass materialism that degrades the human being, and actually you must. And I think that's why the Tagore quote like moves me so much, which is to say that actually the most promising fruit of like modernity is not just technology, not just science, but actually like the birth of modern man, and a modern man who like has, yeah, like as a complete human being, has a sense of his place in the world, has a sense of how actually like he will shape history. And if anything, like that technology, that science is part of freeing man to now ascend to like a higher state of being. And I don't know, I just think I'm still thinking about it, but I just think there's something very interesting to me in that like dynamic of like colonialism, like modernity, like industrialization in the material world, and then how ideas and how man is able to almost move through that stage and then potentially reach another stage. Where I don't know, I guess it's like it feels kind of Hegelian or like dialectical.
No. Yeah, but it puts the principal weight upon the ideological struggle.
Yes.
Yes, exactly.
I think, well, I think this is just a hunch, but I actually feel like this partially explains North Korea.
Say that again.
I think it partially explains North Korea,
Okay.
the development of North Korea, and like there's like this whole the whole like Juche thing.
Yeah.
It's like it's basically this kind of like with like a man-centered like philosophy, and I feel like we've studied it. I bring it up because we've studied it before, but I think in many ways like I think each country kind of has its own way of also arriving there, but in a lot of ways you could say like the way that specifically a society like North Korea relates to the West is like probably the most similar to how Black America relates to the white man, because it's like I remember not a while back, it's like even in a Du Boisian sense, like in some way, whether it's like North Korea, like China, I think to a large extent, maybe like Cuba, but like specifically, like I say this as someone I guess who has like thought about Korea a lot, but the way that Du Bois says like, how does it feel to be a problem in Souls of Black folks? That is the exact same way that the North Koreans are understood. It's like you are a problem which has to be basically like stomped out or erased. And it's like, like a society like North Korea is a problem for like this kind of universalized, like Western, like liberal democracy notion of the world. And it's just not to say that every like society has to follow the path of North Korea. But the other thing is that I remember because we'd studied the Bandung Conference of 1955, and part of what was really beautiful about studying that particular like historical moment was all of these leaders and representatives, many of whom had been part of these anti-colonial struggles in their own countries, coming together. It's so clear how much they had a sense of we can actually decide humanity's future. Not one on a basic level because we constitute the world's majority, like even on like numerical terms. Also, it's because like, we are conscious of ourselves as having come out of a struggle for our freedom. And we are conscious of ourselves also in terms of recognizing this urgent necessity for peace so that our countries, our people can develop and actually attain like a new stage of like prosperity, a new stage of social relations and all that stuff. But I think in some ways part of what was always kind of the attention or ambivalence there was like, in some ways they almost took the West too much on good faith. I felt, where it's like this, which also manifests in like the non-aligned movement in some ways, where it's like, yeah, like it's like, oh, like, you know, and it makes sense. It's like after you attain independence, it's not like you're going to try to like burn down the West or something. But it's like, yeah, like we want to welcome partners, like we want to welcome relations with all governments. Like this is part of what it means, like the construction of a new world system of actual equality and actual world democracy. But I think it's like on the one hand, like, yeah, obviously these countries needed economic development, they needed investment, and like that's understandable. Like China could not remain poor, you know, for example. But it's like at the same time, it's like I think in many ways, what we are seeing now is the fruition of like, oh, look, you can't just take the West at their word. Like, you can't take them always at face value when they say, oh yeah, we want to partner with you and invest in your country, and like that's all. Like it's like, oh, like we can be equals now, and I feel like, yeah, like whether it's like Russia, whether it's Gaza and the Palestinians and the entire Arab world, whether it's China, I think the world is having to grapple with like, yeah, like we can't, yes, we want to relate as equals, but there's something wrong here still in the equation of like, the West does not see us as equals, clearly. And it's like, okay, like how do you deal with that?
But I think in some ways, I feel like that's the lesson that like has been arrived at now.
Yeah.
Where in 1955, like I think maybe like it's not that good faith was completely unwarranted, because I feel like our trajectory or our chronology is also that the U.S. becomes like the monster that it does, especially like starting in the 50s, like through the 60s, and especially like after like the demolishment of the civil rights movement and through like the 80s, like the counter-revolution. And so I feel like now more than ever, it's actually the most necessary to force that break between like, okay, like, yes, like we can economically develop, like maybe Western economic development is not inherently bad, like maybe it can produce like morals or like values that don't inevitably determine or like is inevitably determined to wage war or like nuclear annihilation. But I feel like now it is. And I think, but I also think that it's useful or interesting that through the last decades, it hasn't been, and it also does not necessarily need to be wholesale, I think, like complete rejection and like isolation from the West, where I think actually it's useful for there to be some like exchange or encounter to actually learn from like what are the worst aspects and what are the things that can be used or like channeled towards other ends. And I think that's again where Black people in America like are an example, where I was thinking of like, yeah, like Eddie's example of the saxophone, which is like maybe like Western technology, but like it has new dimension, like new meaning. It actually has a much greater like human value and artistic value in like the hands of Black people. And I feel like the other is like Christianity, which is not even like a physical material force, but is an ideology. And how Black people in America, like with the Black church, like Black faith, like it can be actually like welded, I think, towards more human ends. And I think in some ways that's also the example of how, like when Baldwin says like, yes, like we're Western, but we're not European. And I think that's like one possible path, where like the rest of the world obviously will not be should not be Western even, but that there are ways in which some things can become universal, like part of the human heritage, and other things like cannot be left to stand as
You know, this is what I'm getting at right now, like the necessity of modernity or the path to modernity that Black thought puts Black thought foundational as is this ability to deal with complexity. You know, we talked about this a little bit in reading group, where like.
Can I say one other thing? And disappointment and betrayal.
And disappointment and betrayal.
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
And you know, because for example, you know, it's really nice and clean and convenient to like look at like Western thinking, like Lenin's imperialism, which I'm also a big fan of, where you know it's like it follows propositional logic. if capitalism, then monopoly. If monopoly, then war and colonialism. I love it. Very simple, very straightforward.
Very, very logical.
Yes, yes. Which, to a certain extent, is useful, but it's not enough to make sense of the world as it is right now, and certainly it's not enough. For example, to do what Murray and I've been talking about, how do you even extract and deal with the West on the most fruitful terms? How do you deal with all of these human beings and offer them a path towards the future? The white modernity is so constraining. It grabs you by the neck and kind of drags you along this very narrow path, and it doesn't take you very far. It doesn't take you nowhere, anyways. And this ability to deal with complexity and this idea of the modern man, the modern black man, is so like broad and freeing. I mean, you talked about it with the woman, how the black woman is able to be so much more than even the Asian or other traditional woman who, is a beautiful and full woman in her own right. And so, yes, this complexity that is needed to deal with the modern world, I think I've only encountered it in Black thought.
Well, I wanted to come back to this question of like modernity, but also to I think it was something that Purva said while talking about the essay, that how blues is, it can't be really seen as, it can't be understood entirely as folk music, but you have to see it as urban, and because it's like it's tied to the question of freedom at every stage. And I was thinking of, because like he's also talking about Tagore, how, Tagore, I mean, not just Tagore, but pretty much all artists of, like during the freedom struggles of, formal colonized, places, they all, in some sense, and I think Tagore is most talked about in this way, where he would be a modern articulator of folk art, and this is how he is seen in this way a lot. And he would literally take these folk music, and he would like radically change the meaning of what those songs were. Like, for instance, he would take something that's like purely religious, and he would make that song about the freedom struggle. Or he would like take a like song of the fishermen, which talks about peace and calm and so on, and just a general sense of the suffering in human life. And he would take that to make it something about, okay, like now the time is now, the world has come rushing to your doors, and you better stand up and fight. So he would completely change the meaning of a lot of folk art, folk music, to make something new of it. And I mentioned him because I think he's an example of something that many other people have also done. But the way Baldwin talks about the blues, and also what Purva was saying about blues being an urban music, I think there's something very different in Baldwin's understanding of folk, because he's also, at every point, he's also, it's like he's taking us behind the veil, to use the boss's word, and he's showing that what black folk music talks about is something absolutely concrete, and concrete in the sense that the reality that, say, Bessie Smith talks about is still a reality today. So it's not the same relationship that, say, a Tagore has with Indian folk, but it's something that's living. It's something like the human condition that Bessie talks about is not a relic of the past, and therefore Baldwin talking about blues, or us thinking about what, how to see, like, what really is, like, to see music as an essential part of the black social system, which basically prepares for the revolutionary capacity of black people. It's, I think, I was thinking of the question of blues because this was I also used to think of blues as folk music, I think. and not necessarily urban.
Interesting.
Yeah, because this is also like a framework, right? Where you think of jazz as more urban, deriving from the blues, and the blues being something about the past and so on. But it seems like that the blues needs to be understood as something like it is talking about the reality today. It is talking about the the emancipatory struggle for today. Um, yeah, I just wanted to put that in because yeah, I don't have answers to it, but it was a yeah.
My only question was how did this is to that for you because I'm like like rhythm and blues it came out not as like all of a sudden it was here but why does that get called rhythm and blues?
Well, can I just say rhythm is very important because you remember that I implored you to become a rhythm and blues singer, remember? And because I trace what we call rhythm and blues, and that's that has to do with marketing and labeling, but I trace it to 1959 and Smokey Robinson in particular, his kind of, but not him, but 1959, the same year that Miles Davis's Kind of Blue comes out, the same year that John Coltrane's Giant Steps comes out, and the same year that Ornette Coleman's Shape of Things to Come. In jazz, these are the three considered that then takes us to the next stage. But rhythm and blues has what the blues does not have, and that is the black romantic ideal. There is, I think the blues, like Du Bois called the religious, the narrative of a disappointed people, and that is the blues. But rhythm and blues is a celebration of the black man and woman. And it is, the romantic ideal in the ways that we have used it. It is not the sexual idea, it is the romantic idea. And that's why these men singing it the way they do defies all of the feminist critiques of black men, including Barack Obama with his foolishness about black men and all that. But the rhythm and blues, and that's, you hear it, the Philly sound is a major place for it. Even more than Motown, by the way, is the R&B. So when I think of R&B, I'm thinking of a period essentially from 1959 to about the mid 80s. And it is, displaced by hip hop and rap. And I got a friend who we met in Whole Foods, and he told me, I want you to stop talking about hip hop. You talking about rap, and I forgot that I talked about it recently. But there is something disjunctive
Right.
about what hip hop represents and its values as against what we call R&B represents, or we could even call it modern African American popular music. It is the romantic ideal, and the role, by the way, interestingly, of the falsetto voice, of the tenor voice, and of course, this brings to the fore Tom Bell, but also others like Bunny Sigler, and such and such and so. That's what I would say.
Because I'm interested in what Emilia brought up about the counter revolution,
Yes.
and that, well, I guess, I don't know, started. I don't know if it's the word start, but what you had said in that period of the 80s.
Yes. Yes.
And I think I want to suggest also like the implications or tendencies of R&B in the period between 19 or 59, like you suggested, to the 80s, and their particular responsibility, which necessitated that Black romantic ideal, which is, I mean, I feel like part of what creates that ideal is a necessity for freedom.
Yes.
And that freedom encompasses something about what we were talking about, civilization, the values,
That's right.
etc.
And see, and then the, this, because see, prior to this and the civil rights, freedom movement, and all that, Black people had been misrepresented
Right.
by the entertainment, film
Right.
complex.
Right.
So all of the films about Black people were Toms, Coons, Mammies, Bucks. There's a famous book on that. And everything about Black people was negative. In other words, the concept that we Black people devalue American society.
Right. Right.
Can you?
Right.
We devalue. Think of all the value that we have produced, but the concept told and preached to us, so much so that we began to believe it, that we devalue American society, that physiologically everything about Black people was ugly. Our lips, our nose, everything, the color of our skin. This was ugly. And then you get this renaissance of the struggle for human dignity. And so when Poochie writes a song, when the Delphonics sing, La La means I love you, or Allah means I love you, or the other songs, when you going to break your promise, all of these beautiful poetic songs, who are they sing? Black man singing to a Black woman about how beautiful she was. Ebony eyes, ebony woman, very famous Billy Paul. Billy Paul his music is so conscious, but this is another thing that has a resonance for colored modernity because it's different for men and women. When you tell your daughters or whatever that they're ugly, that's traumatizing. So if you have music saying you are beautiful, you know what I'm saying? This is why rhythm and blues, this popular music is so important because of its moral content. There is no, I don't know of any R&B, serious R&B that's negative. It's always positive about the Black human being. Motown do it one way, Philly International do it better. You understand what I'm saying? But it's all about, and then of course to add to it, orchestration.
Right.
That don't mean the violin is a superior instrument to the alto sax or whatever, but it just means that when we sing about ourselves, we're going to do it in the grand scale. That didn't mean you had about 4 or 5 people playing the violin from the Philadelphia Orchestra. You pay them, minimum wage or whatever, But it gave a lushness and a fullness to it all. And I think this is the most important thing. And the way the romantic ideal, the Black romantic ideal, then is underpinned by the struggle for peace and social justice. So you get Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes, wake up everybody. Oh, go ahead, man. Huh? Yeah. But I mean, it's so beautiful and uplifting to humanity.
Yeah.
Because women of all of the colonized countries been told they're not beautiful, you know, and such. But here,
Yeah, no, I mean, the reason why I brought that
I
up,
wonder, and in South Korea, where black music, and in Japan, where black music is really strong, I wonder how it reshapes the Korean or the Japanese woman's sense of herself and the Korean man's sense of the beauty of the women of Korea, of Japan.
Male woman relationships are pretty bad in South Korea. Man woman relationships.
Yeah, yeah, I can understand. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I'm
no,
sorry.
the only reason why I was bringing it up partially is like, dealing with the problem that we're talking about. Like, how do we understand, whiteness in whether that be South Korea or Japan or China or like Taiwan or the
It's what Jerry
India.
is saying. It
There's that
affects
question.
everything. You accept the white value system. How can I see a Korean woman as beautiful?
Right. Right.
And you got to get. Isn't Korea one of the centers of plastic surgery and
Yeah.
nose jobs and stuff? Okay. And Ghana is one of the centers of skin lightening.
Yeah.
She.
And I guess I'm thinking about how in the 80s, like when we were talking about hip hop, because I feel like that's the problem. That disconnect, that disjunction is part of the issue that we're now dealing with. Because I think what we were also talking about earlier with that connection that you had brought up with none of this article and Kathy's article
Yes.
is that music is a way to struggle.
Yes.
It is almost maybe the most refined or most advanced part of the struggle.
I can see that. I can see that.
And so if that is being said, and like music, like you had mentioned in the R&B, like had that philosophical and revolutionary endeavor. All that turnover, that certain turnover, whether that be because of developments in history of modern, or what I'm saying is like technology either developed a certain way, wars or the assassination of Martin Luther King, like things that had happened that also created in the late 70s, or like drugs or whatever. It is also true that music in the 80s had to have a revolutionary focus for it to combat white on black people. And the problem with music that comes out of the 80s, the 90s, and the early 2000s is that it has no sense of that responsibility. Like there is no real focus on what it is responsible to. Like what is the and I'm only saying it like that, which is like, I mean, I apologize if I'm being misunderstood. I'm not trying to kind of like down put down anybody and a certain kind of moral value that a person as an individual wants to act. But I'm saying like, well, what is the revolutionary? What is something that music or that artists that want to be musicians, focus upon as creating or being able to articulate a defense against a counter-revolutionary period. And if that part isn't figured out, then music would not be it won't be able to emancipate people. And the reason why I bring that up is because now I feel like in order to deal with this question of modernity, what all people, South Koreans or like everybody, would need to do is have a certain language. Now, we can also, it's true, going in a sense, back is also going ahead because you realize that what is important as a revolutionary, what are the revolutionary qualities? Why are the Delphonics societalists? Why Tom? Why? But then I can't say that I can. Okay, the other question I have is what makes this time apparently different from that period from 1959 to 1980. What makes this period what makes this period different? What are the revolutionary qualities that we need to focus on that makes beauty exist? So it's a matter of, like, for me, then how to bridge that gap. And then, well, yeah, sorry, I was just like, yeah, I don't mean to be serious, but no, I got you. No, you're all good, but then be able to articulate something new, to move forward into a new, time and space. And the reason why I say it like that is because I think in addition to these questions of music and revolution, is our obvious study of James Baldwin. And, that whole articulation, God's revolutionary voice, why does he also reveal so much? What is it that, I guess, in this moment we have to help, figure out what can be music at all.
That's right. That's right.
But sorry, I'm not. I'm letting him talk. I don't mean to.
No, I just find it that this idea of creating the new human being, the new modern, as opposed to the European concept of, and that if you listen to that rhythm and blues, I don't care if it's Smokey, or Tom Bell, or William Hart Muhammad. It's this desire for the new human being, the new black person. It's all over Billy Paul, by the way. The new human being. The hip hop revolution went negative.
Yeah.
It really did. Is that fair to say? It went negative and thus closed the door to the possibility of the new human being. Go ahead, man. Just speak up a little bit here.
But based on what you're talking about right now, the thing about it is there was a lot of other factors at play that caused hip hop to turn away again. Well, ultimately, hip hop was born out of R&B.
Yes, definitely.
That's its mother. But talking about music, talking about forms of music, hip hop was influenced by the culture. In the 70s and the 80s, you're talking about a serious drug culture that most people were feeling. In the 70s, there was a serious
Yep.
but people were doing coke a lot. Well as the fact that man and woman dynamics as far as like, in play. So the music that you were hearing was basically an expression of people who was trying to connect with their families to do those kind of things. Or that song with a man, that guy, his woman left, he didn't leave him. She just went. He thought he left him.
Yeah.
He made that song. He thought it's one of the greatest songs in the world. You know? But the 80s was heavily influenced by the crack. That's what the issue was at the time. People was really, and it was a terrible time. I remember when I was little, there was a lot of effort towards keeping the community together. There was always block parties, every block had captains, and to get together and have a lot of communal organization. But once crack happened, people started locking the doors, started barring. people stopped trusting each other. And the music started heavily reflecting the experience. But hip hop at the time was still very more so positive. It was more so about arguing and stuff like that. It wasn't until late time in the mid '80s where certain ideas like NWA, they were the catalyst to turning around the vision. But they were only talking about what they were living in West Coast. You know what I mean? Big cops busting their head and bringing in, like all kinds of weapons in the community. However, there was a fight. In the community, there was a musical band. There was a song one time called Self-Destruction. One band to Self-Destruction. It was very broad. Everyone knew what was happening. But the major factor is everyone compromised. The major factor everyone in the world is a certain level of commercialism. People wanted to sell out because they wanted the money, they wanted the success and the fame that they were getting. On top of that, in comparison to those other times, when it comes to us, we're nowhere near as creative as our parents and grandparents. We're not creative when we should be. We're consumers. They're creative. That's so much. But that's reflecting on what you were saying about people in Mexico. They don't want to let go of that old tradition of manually doing things and rightfully so. Because if all of our technology shut down today, we need all that old stuff. Promise. So it's not something that we just can throw away and say that it's trivial. All of our experiences to this point, making a wheel, you're making clothes, like all those things, every business has to be kept seriously. And it's almost like in a certain type of conditions, but we never forget the stages of development that we were. But the most important thing to getting to creating that new human being is people have to get back to creating stuff. We're consumers, man, on a whole nother level, and it doesn't make any sense. You want to buy everything at every second. But I remember when I was little, man, you could go to Sears and buy your small things. Little boy, people still making things, they're still putting things together. You can fix your TV, you can fix your refrigerator, you can fix your stuff. You can't fix any of these things now because they have something built in as obsolescence. It breaks down. We just go buy it again. It's not at the end of the day, it's not what somebody decides. It's what you're buying. You got, we're the ones. So we have to be the ones to change our, what do we want from ourselves? In the old world, our part of the civilization, our ancestors thought the gun was an unmanned weapon. And absolutely, they're right. However, it was the technological catalyst, it was the turning point of the world. And it changed everything. And now we're at the same place. And people had the same position of, we're at one of these points again where we have to work with what we have to get to the next point, So it's a lot of really looking at what we have and looking at where we are, what we want to be, where we want to. Or ultimately, we know we don't want to just be consumed. We know we want to produce. We want to make our own home. We want to paint our own picture. We want to do that. At least lots of you think. If you want to nurse the beauty of the human spirit, you have to do these things yourself.
Yeah.
Otherwise, leave it to computers.
Right.
Let me make surfing and then Purba, and then we'll do some of what the chats are saying.
I wasn't going to say too much. I just know that in addition to all that, like you had mentioned, like choosing the gun, and maybe this is like too philosophical. But what's been really on my head recently is the moral choice, or like, you know, your moral obligations. And I don't know if I'm correct, but I will say that the moral, meaning like, despite, you know, what's happening, there's something like you're saying, what do we want? And that's the moral, that's like the question to like be able to answer. And I think without that, like, without the sense of the moral, or without the sense of what is, like, literally moral to do, then these other questions about the ideological, like, they need each other.
I was just going to add to that, like, you know, even the fact that it's significant what Nandita says about the blues in this essay, and highlighting that it answers a more personal, individual question is very important to say, because what we are also saying through all of this, and I think this is also what you were touching upon, is whether you call it the question of modernity or the question of the moral choice, or even broadly the question of the human future, there is an individual dimension to it, where every human being has to confront these questions within themselves. And the difference is it's individual, but it's not individualistic, where the whole reason to try and answer this question is as much for you to reach a certain level of articulation and consciousness, but that is in service of you becoming something as part of a whole, like you being an agent that actually matters, you know? And I mean, this is also why I agree with Nouri. Every time I read that Tagore quote about what is modern, it gets me, because he's saying that you will always be modern as long as you're on the side of the revelation, truest, fullest revelation of the human spirit. And this is a thing that personally, Eddie and I talk about this a lot, because in me, I think the traditional and the modern, or, you know, all of that, this, it's clashing all the time, you know, because I feel like, I mean, this is just about me, how I'm making sense of this. I think I have traditional thoughts about a lot of things, conservative even, you know, about a lot of things. But then in my mind, it has never been confused with the modern. Like, there's, what I mean to say is there's no contradiction between that and the modern, where it's like, I don't know how to fully say it, but I'm not attracted to that part of ancient Indian history or tradition or civilization that to me does not fulfill any need for me in this moment. But then there are certain things that have so naturally, organically been a part of me that they'll always be there, but they'll become modern in context, you know?
Yeah.
But often that contradiction is brought to a head in a very dishonest way in discourse, where anything that's traditional cannot be compatible with modern, with the modern. And the only way, you know, white society in general, but, you know, the westernized elite everywhere, the only way they have found to address the question of modernity in some ways is through identity. You know, like you take all of these schools of thought, you know, postmodern, post-colonial thought, subaltern, or whatever. I think it tries to get to the essence of the question of what is modern by over focusing on identity as a mediator of that truth, or that question. And I think in some ways, like, I want to suggest that it's not just a consequence of the limitations of white thought and white, I don't know, philosophical worldview or whatever you call it. It's not just a, what am I trying to say?
Byproduct.
Yeah, it's
Derivative.
yeah, I think what I'm trying to say, it's not just that it came as a consequence or a but it's almost like a defining feature of the limitation, where the reason you have to be so hyper focused on identity is because identity itself is very difficult to create out of this worldview. Like, you know, like I was telling Doc that essay on how the Harlem Renaissance is as gay as it's black, that was right after an essay which was talking about the nuclear makeover of America and what it's going to cost the American people, both morally and economically, you know?
Nuclear weapons.
Yeah. You know, $1.7 trillion to build like 22 or something new nuclear submarines, you know. But what I'm trying to say is that these things are not unconnected, because to be a person who can take in good faith that this nuclear makeover of America is the natural path for the American people to move towards, what kind of identity is that? Like, what kind of human being is compatible with that worldview? And maybe it's the vacuum in which these ideas, like the vacuum in which these ideas can even be considered as the truth. It's that same vacuum from which this confusion about identity comes out. Because you don't really know. And I think the other question, and we have to keep returning to it, is the reason to focus that this is, in some ways, there's an individual dimension to it, is it matters what young people like us, what does it mean for me to be a woman, you know, when the whole world is saying the woman is not what we thought it was, you know, it was something else right now. But what does it mean that I'm a grown woman in this time? I'm Indian, but I'm also like living in the world. And I think it's a question everybody has. Like, what does it mean to be a modern man or a modern woman? What is our responsibility to the child? And these are not just like corollary things to the big question. These are part of the big question. Yeah.
Well, I guess, yeah, like a few things. One of which is, yeah, Baldwin says it very often that he's like, it's impossible, white society makes it impossible to become a man. Like he says the achievement of manhood is made impossible by white society. And it's like, that's also how he frames this whole thing of achieving our nation. Like, I think that's also part of Baldwin's conception of like what manhood means. Like, what does, like, why is it that like actual manhood is so impossible in America? But it, like, I agree with what you're saying, where it's like, in some ways, this obsession with identity is the fruit, it's the result of the actual failure to achieve a real identity. So it's like you become obsessed with like labeling yourself a certain way because you need that as a placeholder for this vast kind of confusion which you already have because you don't actually have a real sense of yourself. And the other thing I just wanted to add was I think on the one hand, we're not saying that even, let's say, like art and music, it's solely derivative of like the technological progress. But I do think there's a relationship between it, like you're saying, where simultaneously with the crack epidemic, part of what we're also, I feel like we're trying to make sense of with this counter-revolution against the civil rights movement was deindustrialization. And I think that's also like almost the kind of, there's all of these different kind of planks of the attack, especially on the Black community in the wake of the civil rights movement or in the, especially after the assassination of King, where it's like, I do think, like we've talked about this, where it's like, there is a part of what the music was responding to in the 50s and 60s and I guess 70s was like, yeah, you see like people working, like you see people creating things, right? And like this is even how we understand the Black proletariat, is that they were actually part of, yeah, like the manufacturing system of the country. And instead, basically what you have post 70s and 80s and onwards is the US is decides we're not going to be a manufacturing country anymore. We're going to be a consumer economy. This is also what's going to prop up even the American GDP is all basically consumer services. And like now, like what makes up the entirety of even the domestic American economy is really not production, but it's basically all these like service economy jobs and all that stuff. And yeah, I don't know. I just think that that's interesting as part of it, where it's also the last one I had was part of what a counter-revolution seeks to do is to narrow the possible range of moral choices that people can make. Is to narrow, and to confuse, and to distort the range of what people think is possible. And so part of what our goal is like we need to broaden. our goal is we need to, like, this is what we call like a sky, an imaginary. Like, what do people even conceive as possible for their own lives? This is like basically we've been dealing with like the wreckage of the past like 40 years of you've tried to narrow what people think is actually possible and what people feel their range of moral choices are. And this is also reflected in the music as well. But, yeah.
Well, we're gonna go to the chat unless you go ahead.
I just wanted to talk about, I think this free school was deep because it's kind of hard to actually process everything. Because in some ways, for one, is to say that the reason why colored modernity is important is because we're basically saying that thing of that the path to modernity is not like the scientific development to liberal democracy, but instead is basically a question of human consciousness, like a development of human consciousness itself. And it kind of reminds me of the way Du Bois talks about how he's like, the invention of whiteness is basically a sin against God himself. Like, he says like, the invention of whiteness is a sin against humanity itself, time itself, and God itself.
Prophet Cherry.
Yeah, which is well, because the thing that Shambarto brought up about the blues, well, what's hard is because I feel like what we're doing is we're basically explaining something that has been concrete, except philosophically, and that's where I'm like, my brain has to work really hard. Or what Shambarto's saying about the blues not being folk music, but instead what we're talking about is like the first modern music created by a modern people on this continent. And in some ways, they were forced to become modern. And I don't know, I was trying to connect all this because, like, I guess two things is, one, what you were saying, Doc, about Nazism is always possible, fascism is always possible, like genocide is always possible. Like, these are all possibilities. And essentially, the revolutionary question is, how do you increase human beings' capacity to make certain choices or moral choices that it reduces it reduces the possibilities of genocide, it reduces the possibilities of something like Nazism, for example. And that is why, like what Serafina was saying about why she's thinking about the moral choice a lot, like me too. It's why the moral choice is the revolutionary choice. And that's also why I think the individual question, like the micro macro is so important. Like we're not focusing on individuals to be a celebration of individualism, but rather that individuals in this time, and especially in terms of modernity, becomes a very important question in order to change history or transform the world. And that's something that can't be ignored anymore. It's almost like human history has reached a point where like the individual human being must make a choice on behalf of humanity. And it's why I think the concrete of both rhythm and blues celebrating the romantic ideal, and then also the way the Black social system treats children becomes the two concrete important cases that I think Nanata talks a lot about, except Nanata talks about music, not necessarily rhythm and blues, but Nanata talks about like the blues, for example, where the reason why I think the romantic ideal is really important is because the romantic ideal, we talk a lot about this, I get this from you, Doc, that romantic love is not like sexual love. Romantic love is in some ways a very high form of human consciousness. And it's another way of saying that romantic love on an individual level is also the key to love. Like this great human love that is a transformative force in humanity. And another way of saying it is like, I always think of the two Stevie Wonder songs, Love's in Need of Love Today, and then also Isn't She Lovely, where he's talking about his daughter who was just born. Where like, it really, I know it sounds stupid, but it really amazed me when I realized that Isn't She Lovely is about a child, like a baby. It's not about his lover, it's about a baby. And that lyric where he says, isn't she lovely, made of love? And the way that Black people cherish children, because in some ways the child represents a creation of love, and that when you love children, you're loving love. It's like the thing of like love's in need of love today. And And it's also, well, because my favorite part of Nanta's essay, and I'm sorry because everyone hasn't read it yet, but so I'm referencing things that we haven't read together, but she says, if you notice, especially compared to, it's in some ways it's an act of amazement, which is, like, we've all noticed it. Something that always struck me in Philly is the way that you pass by certain homes in West Philly and you see this big banner that says, this kid just graduated from elementary school. My kid graduated from middle school. My kid graduated from high school. Congratulations, graduate. Like, it could be something as quote unquote simple as middle school, but they will celebrate, Black families will celebrate everything they can celebrate when it comes to their child. Yeah, or mourning, like the balloon release of like when the child passes away or anyone passes away. But especially, I was always amazed at this great celebration of a child's graduation or birthday, public, not private, public. And like the way Nanata described it was, she was like, it's a claiming of a victory, and it's a victory for the community because it's a claiming of a victory against a whole system determined to destroy your child. And that is a very deep, to me, that's a very deep thing. Like, it's also, I noticed it because every time I would go buy balloons for people's birthdays, the only people who are buying balloons, which are kind of like, in some ways, in immigrant culture, the Asians are like, I don't want to spend money on balloons. Like, why would I spend money on balloons when I could like do other things for you? But it's like, when I always go to a dollar store to buy like inflated balloons, always the other people who are buying balloons it's always Black people because they're buying balloons for a celebration, a retirement, a child's birthday, and it's a way of claiming. It's a like very public celebration of a victory against. In some ways, it's like an act. It's a cherishing of life itself, like which the society kind of takes for granted and is like determined to destroy. And I don't know, I guess I just wanted to say that because, like, yeah, it's this, I think it's also that Baldwin thing of the micro macro, like, the connection between the micro act of an individual, which has complete implications for the macro of society. And like, yeah, and it's funny because Baldwin describes it as the battle of the gods at the end of No Name in the Street, which I always find interesting, where he describes it as like the battle of the gods between like all that is universal or ancient versus this new god of like white supremacy. It's like, it has the way that he's talking in terms of great, like, it's not just about nations battling, but it's a battle of the gods. It's the battle over humanity itself.
Because Billy Paul's album in 1973 that I think Michelle really identified, I was like, oh wait, that's kind of deep. I don't know why I didn't think about it. He was really moved by What's Going On by Marvin Gaye around the Vietnam War, and he worked with everyone. He needed to make War of the Gods, which has the craziest looking album art in my opinion, but it's really deep. I think the song that Michelle I really identified is called Peace, Holy Peace, and I don't really know actually how the song goes, but I'm just like, it's so interesting. You can actually see this as a war of gods. It's like he says, but sisters and brothers, we're living in trying times. Everybody is talking and everyone's planning their futures, but they should be thinking about right now, we should be trying to clean out our hearts, straighten out our minds, looked after some brother so he can shine, peace, shine, peace. I was like, I wish I knew how that song went because I have to, there's so much to listen to, but that's a cool connection.
Yeah. Okay. So once again, I'm going to summarize. We'll only pick and choose comments. Sorry. But okay. So Todd, BK, Matt, Nancy Meyer, M. Sparks, Bambala, said good morning. Todd said that there's an interesting analysis by Professor Masad on quote Western values, which Todd interprets as maybe the white social system.
I'm sorry. Forgive me.
Okay, so Western values and how they might be integral for genocide. BK said this was a great event. And then, the NOI event. And then, let's see. Bombalai 7 said, life is like a crucible. We have to remove the impurities to become pure gold. And then remarked on the Pepperidge Farm Milano cookies that were on the table.
Not on the table anymore.
Yeah, BK said, great history of Islam, great breakdown, very informative. Bombalai 7 said, I agree that Nobel Prize awarded to AI was very questionable. The full effects of AI are yet to be seen. And absolutely, the white elite Western mindset has failed, not only the US, but actually the world. I love Coltrane's music. I love Supreme, R&B, blues, gospel, and jazz are a gift to mankind, and soul as a genre. The truth is evident in the music. Curtis Mayfield, Marvin Gaye, Gil Scott-Heron, Earth, Wind and Fire, Charles Mingus, the list is endless. And then someone whose username is JHS Scott. Oh, okay. JH Scott 7. References Billy Paul, Let Him In. Veronica Ankrum said good morning from Vancouver, Washington. Someone whose username is SCH says the West is a good anti-role model. You can learn what not to do. And then Jahan had a comment. He says, interestingly, the white supremacist social system theory allows us to understand the world historic significance of the Russian Revolution, as well as the counter-revolution of 1991, much better than a narrow theory of Marxism, Leninism, or class struggle.
Wow. He said that the white supremacist social system is a better lens through which to understand the Russian Revolution.
That's what he's saying.
That's interesting.
I would like to hear more.
Yeah.
I would like to know more.
Yeah.
But then he says, this makes me believe that Du Bois is essential for a serious understanding of communism or communist theory today, and everything missing him is infantile. And then, yes, Black music has had a huge impact on Asia, and this discussion helps me understand why Michael Jackson, for instance, has been such a giant in South Asia. And then BK says, yeah, hip hop was infiltrated very swiftly, and whatever its revolutionary fire was extinguished by the mid-90s. And then Bombalai 7 says that they agree that hip hop was a source of knowledge and revolution in its early days. And then, yeah, Bombalai 7 is just responding to, I think, the recent remarks of like, yes, economics is destroying art. We're asking questions of how to awaken the masses and to break free from a reactionary mindset. And then somebody said the reactionary mindset was an important stage of human development and should be acknowledged as a relic of history. Despite being used by states to whip their population into categories, the mindset is helpful as a reference point. And so I think what they're saying is that that mindset is helpful for us to examine and to basically find a way out of. But yeah, it's not a good thing in and of itself. Yeah, so those are the comments.
Okay. Well, if there's no other comments, we can end the live stream for today. And we'll see you all next week. Bye.